Today's episode is a fan favorite. The audio in the story has been remastered for today's episode. In January of 2012, a police truck parked on a trail in Griffith Park in Los Angeles, California. A member of the canine unit opened the door, and a police dog named Indiana Bones jumped out. Indy quickly caught a scent and led his handler to a mound of dirt just off the path. Indy pawed the dirt and suddenly revealed the top of a plastic bag. The dog's handler reached into the dirt and pulled out the bag, and when she looked inside, she saw 2 dismembered human feet and a hand. Indy's discovery would launch an investigation that would lead 2 LA detectives into the most insane case they'd ever worked, a case that would involve everything from Mexican drug cartels to a Canadian cannibal. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, the next time the follow button goes camping, wait for them to go to bed for the night, at which point light and then throw a Yon Shakaduma firework onto their tent. Okay, let's get into today's story. On Christmas Day 2011, 67-year-old Hervey Medellin turned off the oven in his apartment in Hollywood, California, opened up the oven door, and pulled out a casserole dish covered with foil. Hervey looked up at the clock and smiled, because his friend, who was coming over for a holiday visit, would be there any minute, and the food he was making had finished cooking at exactly the right time. He turned down the radio playing Christmas music in the kitchen and called out to his roommate, Gabriel Martinez, and told him lunch was almost ready. Gabriel had his eyes glued to his laptop, totally engrossed in whatever it was he was doing, and so he just gave Hervey a sort of grunt of acknowledgement. Hervey responded with an irritated sigh. Gabriel, who was 30 years younger than Hervey, had been spending so much time online lately that he barely connected with the world around him. Hervey realized it was very likely a generational thing, but he didn't understand why anyone would want to spend so much time just staring at a computer screen. But Hervey refused to be bothered by Gabriel today. It was Christmas, and Christmas was a time for joy, friends, and good food. Hervey set down the hot casserole dish on the table in the small dining area, and he looked around with satisfaction at all the Christmas decorations he had spent hours hanging up. Hervey's entire one-bedroom apartment now looked like it had been decorated by a professional interior designer. But perhaps the most impressive part of the decorations was not actually the Christmas stuff. It was the paintings that were hanging on the walls. These were not paintings that would be found in most small one-bedroom apartments. These were original works by famous artists. Just then, the doorbell rang, interrupting Hervey's thoughts, and Hervey removed his oven mitts and went to open the door. And when he did, he saw his friend Amelia standing there, holding several wrapped presents. Hervey grinned and said Merry Christmas and gave Amelia a big hug. Then he led her inside and told her to put the presents down, because before they got to presents and to food, he had to show her something. Amelia put down the presents, said hello to Gabriel, and then Hervey took her hand and led her across the front room. Then Hervey pointed to a painting hanging on the wall, and he could hear Amelia gasp. She turned to Hervey almost in disbelief and asked if it was an original. Hervey smiled and nodded. He said the last time he'd gone down to Mexico, where he was originally from, he had acquired this painting, which was an original work of art by Diego Rivera, one of the most famous Mexican painters to have ever lived. After staring at this painting with his friend for several minutes, Hervey said it was time to go eat. He told Gabriel to put his computer away for a while and join them, and then the 3 of them headed to the table and dug into the casserole Hervey had prepared. While they ate, Hervey told Amelia more about his latest trip to Mexico and also about the travel plans he was making to destinations all over the world. Hervey said sometimes he still couldn't believe this was actually his real life. He'd worked so hard from the moment he came to the United States as a young man, with the hope that one day he'd be able to do whatever he wanted. And now he felt like he'd accomplished that. He was retired and filling his days with adventure and art. Hervey, Amelia, and Gabriel spent the day eating, talking, laughing, and exchanging gifts. For Hervey, who had spent most of his life far away from his family, this really felt like the perfect holiday. and other than maybe traveling, he couldn't imagine a better way to spend his time than eating delicious food and catching up with friends. By late afternoon, Amelia said unfortunately she had to go home, so Hervey walked her to the door. He gave her another big hug, wished her Merry Christmas again, and said he couldn't wait to get together with her in the new year. More than 3 weeks later, on the morning of Tuesday, January 17th, a dog walker named Lauren Kornberg left her house with her mother and 9 dogs. They headed toward their usual hiking path, which cut through an area called Bronson Canyon. Bronson Canyon is located inside of Griffith Park, which is basically LA's equivalent to New York's Central Park, but it sits high above the city. It was the perfect winter morning in Los Angeles, which meant it was a crisp 50 degrees and the Hollywood Hills were bathed in soft orange sunlight. So Lauren and her mom took the dogs up a side path that branched out from the main hiking trail, and once they were far enough away from other hikers, they let the dogs off leash. And as soon as that happened, the dogs instantly began playfully running around together, but one of them, a golden retriever, broke away from the pack and wandered over toward a bushy area next to a shallow ravine off the side of the path. And this golden retriever began digging in this one area of the brush. Lauren watched as the retriever pulled out a plastic bag from the brush and then began sniffing it. And as the dog began to sort of vigorously paw at this bag, a large round object suddenly rolled out of it and began tumbling down into the ravine. 2 other dogs from the group, a husky and a small terrier, ran down the ravine after this big round object. And Lauren's mom asked what had just rolled out of the bag. Lauren said she didn't know, but it sort of looked like a movie prop, which wouldn't actually be an unusual thing to find lying around, because there were Hollywood special effects and prop houses not too far from here, and many movies and TV shows were filmed in this area. Lauren's mom walked over toward the ravine to try to get a better look at this movie prop, but as she got close to the edge, she looked down and saw that the dogs were no longer playing. In fact, the terrier was backing away from this object with its hair up, like the dog was terrified. And so Lauren, she kind of leaned forward and looked as best as she could to see what this object was. And suddenly, when one of the dogs stepped out of the way, she had a clear line of sight onto this object. And when she saw what it was, she began backing away too. Because the object was no prop. It was a real severed human head. About an hour later, helicopters loudly hovered over the canyon and police blocked access to the entire area, as more than a dozen LAPD cruisers, CSI units, and news vans parked along the nearby scenic overlook. Detective Chuck Knowles and his partner, Detective Lisa Sanchez, walked up the trail and met with the uniformed officers who had cordoned off the area with police tape. By this point, crime scene investigators had retrieved the severed head from the ravine and brought it onto the trail. When Detective Sanchez walked over to them and saw the severed head, her stomach churned. She had investigated her fair share of murder cases, but this was the first time she dealt with any kind of dismemberment. As Sanchez began to study the head, one of the uniformed officers walked up to her and told her that the 2 women who actually found the head at first thought it was fake. They thought it was a movie prop. Detective Sanchez could understand why, because there was very little decomposition, and the head was so fresh and pristine that it looked like it had just been removed. From the looks of it, Sanchez believed the head belonged to a man who could be in his 60s, but that was about all she could guess about the victim at this point. So police began fanning out and searching the area, hoping to find some more clues. More helicopters and search units began to pour into the area, and the search expanded to a 7-acre radius. Searchers began entering backyards of the homes in the area, and some of these homes were really expensive houses that belonged to famous movie stars, so the police knew this case was going to draw even more media attention. Around 4:30 p.m., the sun began to set, and despite an exhaustive search of the area, no further human remains turned up. So the searchers left their equipment, kept the area cordoned off, and went home for the night. That evening, reports of the dismembered body found in Griffith Park were all over local news stations. And although violent crime in LA was far from rare, violent crime in this particular neighborhood in Bronson Canyon was almost unheard of. The people who lived in the neighborhood, who were willing to talk on camera, were shocked that something like this could happen just beyond their backyards. People who had been hiking and walking their dogs in Bronson Canyon for years told reporters they were now afraid to step foot on the hiking paths until the killer or killers were apprehended. The following day, LAPD returned to Bronson Canyon and performed a highly organized grid search, scouring the area where the head had turned up. The police were already feeling pressure from the media, city leaders, and local residents to find the people or person who had committed this horrific crime. But Detectives Knowles and Sanchez knew there was still so much physical area to cover and search, and they still had no idea who the victim even was. So this just didn't seem like a case they could just wrap up in a couple of days. And by late morning, the searchers had still found nothing new when a police truck pulled up and a dog handler stepped out with her cadaver dog, a German Shepherd named Indiana Bones, who was famous for being the first four-legged detective on LA County Coroner's team. After getting out of the car, Indy's handler began leading the dog up a nearby hill, and almost immediately as they began to walk, Indy pulled the handler in the direction of this nearby dirt mound. The handler walked over to the mound and, with a gloved hand, began pushing the dirt aside, revealing what looked like a shallow grave. And in this shallow grave was a plastic bag. The handler reached her hands down and carefully cupped them beneath the bag and gently pulled it out of the ground. Then she took a pair of scissors out of her pocket, cut the bag open, and looked inside. And inside, she saw a pair of human feet and a hand. The next morning, Detective Knowles and Sanchez sat at their computers, sifting through recent missing person reports. The victim's torso, or any more of his body, still had not been found. But the detectives hoped that the feet and hand that were found also belonged to their victim, and that with these new body parts, they might be able to connect their victim to somebody who went missing in the area. Just then, the sound of a fax machine broke their focus. Knowles stood up, tore the paper off the machine, and saw that the medical examiner had completed his examination on the severed hand, feet, and head. Knowles scanned the whole report and then read aloud the important parts to Sanchez. The medical examiner had confirmed that all those body parts belonged to the same victim. Also, they said that after the victim was dead, his killer carefully cut apart the man's body, right at the joints in a very precise manner. So whoever cut the body up seemed to really know what they were doing. But what was even more intriguing was that the body parts had been refrigerated before they were dumped, which explained why the head had looked so fresh when it was found. But this made it difficult for the medical examiner to pin down exactly when the victim was killed. However, because the parts were so fresh, the examiner was able to lift very clear fingerprints from the man's fingers. And when he ran those prints through a system, he got a hit. The dismembered man was Hervé Medellin. Knowles sat down at his computer and ran Hervé's name through every database he had access to. And he quickly learned that Hervé had been reported missing just a day before his head was found. The missing persons report had been filed by a man named Gabriel Martinez, who said he was Hervé's roommate. So Detective Knowles and Sanchez got into their car and began driving towards Hervé's apartment, which happened to be just 2 blocks away from the Hollywood police station. While they were in the car, Knowles and Sanchez discussed their game plan for when they talked to this roommate. And their plan was simple: reveal nothing. Although news of the grisly discovery was already all over town, that victim's identity had not yet been released by the media. Only the police knew that information. And so they wanted to feel out what Hervé's roommate knew and didn't know. He was not a suspect yet, but he was definitely a person of interest. The detectives parked at the curb and walked up to Hervé's building. It was this elegantly plain, narrow building constructed in the 1920s that felt totally vintage and old Hollywood. The detectives walked up the stairs to the 3rd floor, to apartment 319, and rang the doorbell. A few seconds later, the door opened and a dark-haired man in his 30s greeted the detectives. They introduced themselves and asked if he was Gabriel Martinez. Gabriel said yes, and then asked immediately if they had news about Hervé. Had they found him? Was he okay? The detectives exchanged a quick glance, and then Sanchez said they were still investigating Hervé's disappearance. And for now, they just needed to speak to Gabriel to try to help with that case. Gabriel suddenly went from being sort of hopeful to looking pretty concerned, but then told them he was glad to tell them anything they wanted, and he asked them to come inside. Once inside, they all sat down at the table in the small dining area. Detective Knowles asked Gabriel when he'd last seen Hervey, and Gabriel said not since shortly after Christmas, on December 27th. That's when Hervey had gone to Mexico. It was where he grew up and where he still had friends and family. Gabriel said that Hervey traveled internationally a lot, and sometimes he would go on these open-ended trips, so Gabriel was not always exactly sure when Hervey was going to come home again. But Hervey had been calling pretty regularly just to check in, and then suddenly the call stopped, so Gabriel started to get really worried and then eventually filed the missing person report. Detective Sanchez asked Gabriel if he had called or texted Hervey after Hervey stopped calling, just to see if maybe he was staying in Mexico longer. Gabriel said he hadn't, but he explained that Hervey had actually left his cell phone behind at the apartment because he didn't get service in Mexico. Now, Gabriel knew there were ways around that, but he said discussing technology with Hervey was usually a losing cause. Hervey just preferred to use a landline and an international calling card whenever he was in Mexico. Sanchez asked if there was a record of these calls from Hervey, and Gabriel said yes, and he grabbed his phone and showed the detectives the calls he'd received from Hervey in January. The detectives saw that these calls were from an international calling card number, which meant they didn't actually know who placed those calls, but it did corroborate what Gabriel had told them. The detectives would talk to Gabriel for a bit longer, but the whole time they stuck to their original plan. They didn't reveal anything about Hervey's murder. Back at the station, Detective Knowles and Sanchez went over what they had so far, and they agreed it was not very much. And what little they did have didn't quite add up. And it really had to do with this trip to Mexico they had just learned about. Did Hervey really go to Mexico and then get murdered and dismembered there? And then his body parts were shipped back to LA and dumped in LA? Or did Hervey come back from Mexico in one piece and then somehow get intercepted before he got home by somebody who then murdered, dismembered, and dumped him? Both these theories just seemed like they were missing something. Like, did Hervey really even go to Mexico? They didn't know. I mean, regardless of what Hervey's roommate Gabriel had told them, the detectives thought it actually made a whole lot more sense that somebody would have killed and dismembered Hervey right there in his own apartment and disposed of him in nearby Griffith Park, which certainly made Gabriel seem very suspicious. The following day, which is now 3 days after Hervey's head had been found, the detectives returned to Hervey's apartment, and this time they showed up with a search warrant, a team of police, and cadaver dogs. Once inside, they let the dogs loose, and the dogs began frantically sniffing around the floorboards, the furniture, and the corners of every room. Meanwhile, Gabriel sat at the table and watched in silence as the investigators practically tore up the tiny one-bedroom apartment. The search team rifled through drawers and closets, they confiscated computers and phones, and they photographed every item inside the apartment. But at the end of the search, they realized they had found absolutely nothing. There was no blood, no hidden torso, no bone saws or other dismemberment tools, and so this apartment just didn't appear to be the place where the murder or dismemberment or both took place. As the search team began to leave the apartment, Detectives Knowles and Sanchez sat down at the table with Gabriel. And Gabriel didn't look angry or raise his voice, but he wanted to know, what had changed since they spoke a day earlier that made the detectives feel like they could come into his and Hervey's home and tear it apart like this. Sanchez whispered something to Knowles, and then she finally broke the news to Gabriel. Those body parts that were found in the canyon that were all over the news belonged to Hervey. Hervey was deceased, and so now Hervey's death was being investigated as a homicide. Immediately, all the color drained from Gabriel's face. He said he couldn't believe it. This didn't seem real. Now, the detectives understood how upsetting this was for Gabriel, but they needed more information. So they pressed Gabriel for more details about Hervey's trip to Mexico. And so, for the next half hour, Gabriel, despite being in shock, was cooperative and answered every question and tried to give detectives any information at all that could be useful. Later that day, the two detectives returned to the station and went into an evidence room where everything collected from Hervey's apartment was laid out on a table. One of the evidence technicians in the room told the detectives that he happened to look at the photos taken of the apartment, and some of the victims' artwork hung on the walls was worth a ton of money. The Diego Rivera painting alone was likely worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Now, this struck the detectives as being really odd. According to the information Gabriel had provided, and based on what the detectives had learned from their databases, Hervey was a retiree, living on a small pension in a small one-bedroom apartment. So how was he also a serious art collector, able to acquire paintings that were potentially worth a small fortune? The following day, so now 4 days after Hervey's head was discovered, a call came through to Knowles' desk. The man on the other end introduced himself as a retired LAPD narcotics detective, and this retired detective said he'd been reading the newspaper that morning and happened to see that the dismembered victim from Griffith Park had been identified. And when he saw the name, Hervey Medellin, it immediately rang a bell. He said back in the early 1990s, when he was investigating a Mexican drug cartel, Hervey's name had come up in the investigation. And in fact, he had interviewed Hervey a couple of times. Knowles kept listening, but right away his mind began to race. A connection to Mexican cartels and drug trafficking could maybe explain how Hervey had enough cash to buy those famous paintings. The retired detective explained that Hervey had worked as a ticket taker for Mexicana Airlines. At that time, that airline was believed to have been used for drug smuggling. And Hervey had become a kind of personal concierge for the wives and girlfriends of drug cartel members. When these women would visit LA, Hervey would book their hotel rooms, arrange shopping trips, and give them dining recommendations. Now, none of that was illegal, so the narcotics detective had no reason to pursue Hervey. He ultimately just kind of became a minor character in a much bigger investigation. But now that this former detective found out that Hervey had turned up dead and dismembered, he wondered if maybe Hervey's connection to the drug cartels had gone much deeper than he realized. As Knowles listened, he was having the same type of thoughts. Was Hervey a drug mule? Were those paintings a form of payment from the cartels? Did Hervey fail to repay a debt, and did the cartel brutally murder him for it? After all, some Mexican cartels were known to behead and dismember some of their victims. Knowles thanked the retired detective for reaching out to him. He hung up and passed this new information along to his partner Sanchez. The detectives now realized they could be in over their heads. Poking the hornet's nest with a Mexican drug cartel is the kind of thing that gets people killed, even cops. Over the next week, Knowles and Sanchez started to pursue this new lead. But they quickly discovered that a potential run-in with a violent Mexican drug cartel was actually not the biggest issue they were facing. Instead, the big issue that kept setting them back was just old-fashioned bureaucracy. Getting Mexican law enforcement agencies to cooperate in any investigation was never really easy, but when the investigation involved the cartels, it seemed almost impossible. Mexican authorities weren't eager to anger the cartels or possibly jeopardize their own investigations into the drug trade just to assist LA cops on a homicide case. And when Knowles and Sanchez turned to federal law enforcement agencies in the United States, they ran into similar problems. The DEA and the FBI were running multiple investigations involving the cartels, and they could not put those at risk just because Hervey had been interviewed by a narcotics cop over 20 years ago. But the FBI did at least tell Knowles and Sanchez that they would dig into Hervey's financial records to see if he had a clear connection to the cartels before he was killed. In the meantime, the feds told the LA detectives to go ahead and stay away from the cartel stuff and just let them handle that. They should just focus on leads that were in the United States. Now, Knowles and Sanchez understood why the feds reacted that way, but they still felt like a huge lead, i.e. going after the cartels, had just been yanked out from under them. On top of that, the FBI had no reason to expedite finding these financial records because this was not their case, so there was no telling how long it would actually take the feds to provide them with any information. Feeling frustrated and a bit lost on what to do next, Knowles and Sanchez turned their focus back to the victim. The detectives reached out to Hervey's LA friends to learn more about who Hervey was. And the picture that began to emerge of Hervey was of a warm, friendly guy who had moved to LA from Mexico as a young man, who had worked hard and was now enjoying his retirement and living the American dream that he had always believed in. Now, Knowles and Sanchez didn't think any of this information really helped their case, and none of it seemed to make Hervey look like a guy who had deep ties to the drug trafficking world. The detectives would still need to hear back from the FBI, but if Hervey had been working with a cartel, he'd managed to keep it pretty secret. So the detectives just kept pushing forward, talking to everyone they could who knew Hervey. And finally, just when they felt like they were running out of people to interview, the detectives did learn something very interesting. Hervey's roommate, Gabriel, was not just his roommate. Gabriel was Hervey's boyfriend. Now, Gabriel had not told the detectives this, and they couldn't believe that he had kept this a secret across the 2 interviews they had done with him. Having an intimate relationship with the victim immediately put Gabriel at the top of the suspect list, and the fact that he had lied about the relationship made him look even more suspicious. So, Knowles and Sanchez called Gabriel into the station for another interview. But when they confronted him, instead of him getting defensive or trying to deny it, Gabriel readily admitted that he and Hervey were indeed in a relationship. He told the detectives he was just a very private person and felt uncomfortable sharing those kinds of details. Sanchez and Knowles did not believe Gabriel, and they told him that because he had hid this information, they felt like he could be hiding something else. But Gabriel insisted he wasn't hiding anything. And then without any further prompting, he opened up about his and Hervey's relationship. Gabriel told them all about how he and Hervey had met, how at first they were good friends, and then they fell in love and moved in together. And after several minutes of this, when the detectives were finally able to steer the conversation back to the weeks leading up to the murder, Gabriel's story about Hervey's trip to Mexico and the phone calls he got didn't change at all. By the end of the interview, Knowles and Sanchez really didn't know what to think. Gabriel had clearly held back information from them about the relationship with Hervey, but when confronted, he told them all about it and then hadn't changed or embellished his story at all from that point forward. And also, they had already searched the apartment and there was no evidence that connected Gabriel to the crime. Not long after this meeting, things only seemed to get worse for the 2 detectives. The FBI came back to them and told them that after doing some digging, they found that Hervey's financial records did not show any connection to any drug cartels, or any other known criminals for that matter. Now, they still couldn't completely rule out the cartel's involvement in this murder, but for now at least, this lead felt like a dead end. By mid-April, so 3 months after Hervey's head had been found, the LAPD finally released Hervey's remains to his family so they could have a proper funeral. Knowles and Sanchez couldn't help but feel like they had let Hervey and his family down. They were no closer to finding the killer or killers than they had been on day 1 of the investigation. And in the weeks following the funeral, Knowles and Sanchez started to get assigned new cases that required immediate action. Hervey's murder was slowly becoming a cold case. Until one day in June, so now 5 months after Hervey's head had been found, Detective Knowles' phone rang, and he had one of the most bizarre conversations he'd had in all his time working in homicide. The caller introduced himself as an investigator with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. For a second, Knowles thought somebody might be prank calling him, because it was not every day an LA detective gets a call from a Canadian Mountie. But the Mountie quickly told Knowles that he'd been made aware of the case from back in January with the severed head and limbs. And the Mountie said they had actually just had a very similar case up in Quebec. A video had been uploaded to the internet that showed this naked man tied to a bed and another individual, dressed all in black, repeatedly stabbing him with an ice pick. And then once the man was dead, the killer dismembered the body before sexually abusing the body and cannibalizing some parts of it. And as if that wasn't brutal enough, the killer then sent other parts of the body to members of Canadian Parliament and several different elementary schools. Detective Knowles just sat there on the phone in silence. I mean, this was a totally brutal and horrible story, but he couldn't see any real connection to Hervey's murder, aside from both victims having been dismembered. But the Mountie continued and said they had actually already arrested this internet killer. And this man, who was a Canadian citizen named Luca Magnotta, was obsessed with Hollywood. He had recently lived in Los Angeles, not far from where Hervey lived, where he acted in porn movies and worked as a male escort before going back to Canada. But the big thing, the real reason the Mountie had called Knowles in the first place, was that while Luca was living in Los Angeles, he kept a blog in which he wrote about his exploits. And one of the things he wrote about was the dismembered body found in Bronson Canyon, Hervey's body. After the call with the Mountie, Knowles quickly met with Sanchez, and the detectives decided the first thing they needed to do was figure out exactly when Luca had been in the United States to see if maybe he could have actually crossed paths with Hervey in late December or January, the time they believed Hervey was killed. They reached out to the agencies in the US and Canada that maintain customs data, and they were able to find out when Luca actually crossed the border into the US and when he went back into Canada. Then they dug into Hervey's customs data to try to nail down the exact time he traveled to Mexico and if and when he came back to the States, in order to see if he and Luca had been in LA at the same time. But while they were looking into this, they discovered something that totally shocked them and made them rethink everything about this investigation. They came to realize that the reason the case had stalled out was because they had been operating under a false assumption the whole time. And after making this huge discovery, Knowles and Sanchez believed they had finally cracked the case. Based on all the evidence gathered throughout the investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Hervey Medellin. At around 3 a.m. on December 27, 2011, the killer crept through Hervey's apartment to the bedroom. The door was cracked open, and the killer looked in and saw Hervey sleeping inside. The killer threw the door open, rushed the bed, and jumped on top of him. Hervey immediately woke up and began yelling as the killer tried to cup their hands over Hervey's mouth to muffle his screams. Hervey kept fighting back, but the killer wrapped their hands around his throat and began to squeeze. Hervey continued to yell, so the killer squeezed harder and harder, and after about 5 minutes of this, Hervey stopped struggling. His face was blue and his eyes were empty. He was dead. The killer remained in Hervey's apartment, and a bit later that morning, they opened up Gabriel's computer and did a search. They pulled up an article titled "Butchering the Human Carcass for Consumption." This article provided detailed instructions on how to dismember a human body for the purpose of cooking and consuming it. Once the killer felt like they had a clear understanding of what to do, they went back to Hervey's bedroom and used a saw they had recently purchased to separate Hervey's head and limbs from his body. The killer then refrigerated those body parts for 3 weeks, but for reasons no one fully understands, the killer never actually consumed any of it. There was no cannibalism, despite clearly there being some level of interest based on that search that was done on Gabriel's computer on the night of the murder. And so 3 weeks after the murder, the killer walked through Bronson Canyon in the dark with Hervey's body parts and dug shallow graves at various spots and buried them. And soon after that, with Hervey now officially out of the picture, the killer was able to transfer all the money from Hervey's personal bank account into the joint bank account they had opened after they had moved in together. Gabriel Martinez murdered his boyfriend Hervey in the apartment they shared. It turned out that before Christmas of 2011, Gabriel and Hervey's relationship had started to completely fall apart. In fact, things had gotten so bad that Hervey told Gabriel he wanted to end things, and he said Gabriel should start looking for another place to live. Gabriel knew he would not be able to afford a Los Angeles apartment or lead the life he'd grown accustomed to on his own because he didn't have a steady income. He had become financially dependent on Hervey, and so, in his desperation, he had decided to kill Hervey and steal his money. On Christmas Day, when Hervey's friend Amelia came over, Gabriel sat on the couch with his laptop, Googling what tools to use to cut up a human body. Being Hervey's significant other and failing to disclose their relationship to police had made Gabriel a leading suspect early on, but police had found no clear evidence pointing to Gabriel or anyone else, so the case had gone cold. But it was the customs data that detectives obtained while following the lead on the Canadian internet killer, Luca Magnotta, that helped lead them back to Gabriel. Customs data showed that Luca had been in Canada at the time Hervey went missing, which ruled Luca out as the killer. But more importantly, this customs data made it clear that Hervey had never actually traveled or even booked a flight to Mexico at any time in late December or January. Gabriel had crafted this intricate lie about Hervey's trip, even providing phone records showing all the times Hervey had called him from Mexico. But once investigators knew Gabriel was lying, they dug deeper into his phone records and discovered the calls had actually come from Herbie's friend, who was calling Gabriel from Mexico, but they were doing so to find out why they had suddenly stopped hearing from Herbie. At this point, the detectives were sure Gabriel was the killer. But the final piece of evidence they would need to convince the district attorney would not be discovered until 2014, over 2 years after the murder. At that time, a city worker was digging in the ground not too far from where Herbie's head had been discovered, and he found a plastic bag containing pieces of decaying human flesh. A DNA sample of this flesh matched Herbie's DNA, but it was actually the bag itself that sealed Herbie's case. Because this was a very specific type of bag, one that was used to protect and transport expensive paintings. And it matched those same types of bags that had been found in Hervey and Gabriel's apartment. Los Angeles detectives tracked Gabriel down in San Antonio, Texas, where he had married a wealthy woman who was supporting him, and with the help of local police, they arrested him. Gabriel was eventually found guilty of murder and sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. A quick note about our stories: they are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, MrBallen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen, produced by Jeremy Bone and Cole Locasio. This episode was written by Kate Murdoch. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, Camille Callahan, Alex Paul, Ben Fasciano. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Locasio and Jordan Stidham. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song, Something Wicked, by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. And just a reminder, every new and exclusive episode we put out on the MrBallen podcast, you can also now watch on the MrBallen YouTube channel that very same day. And trust me, some of these stories you truly have to see to believe. Again, my YouTube channel is just called MrBallen. If you want to listen to episodes 1 week early and ad-free, you can subscribe to SiriusXM Podcast Plus on Apple Podcasts, or visit SiriusXM.com/Podcast Plus to listen with Spotify or another app of your choice. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. In October of 1999, a 911 dispatcher in Austin, Texas, was nearing the end of a long night shift when a strange call came in. The caller was a man who just said his guts had been blown out of his stomach. The dispatcher asked him to explain what actually happened, but the caller wouldn't say. He just kept saying that, he had woken up and his guts were hanging out, and now he's holding his guts in with his hand, and he needed an ambulance right now. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do. So, if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the Follow Button's house and add hot sauce to the solution for their eye contacts. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the night of October 1st, 1999, a 75-year-old man named Steve Beard sat on the patio of his mansion in Austin, Texas, sipping on a cocktail. And it was a great night. Warm evening, the leaves rustling in the trees all around his property, and behind his house there was this creek that was flowing along, and in the house he could hear his wife Celeste washing the dishes. So Steve had met Celeste only about 6 years ago. It was actually shortly after his first wife, Elise, had died of cancer. And Steve had been with his first wife for 45 years, and they'd raised 3 kids together. And he'd just been totally lost after she had passed away. And really, after she had died, he had spent a lot of nights just sitting alone at the Austin Country Club, where actually Celeste had been working as a waitress. Celeste was only 30 years old at the time, which meant she was almost 40 years younger than Steve. But there had been an immediate spark between them, and they got married just over a year later. Now, some of Steve's friends and family had immediately assumed that, given this age gap, that Celeste was simply after Steve for his money. Steve, after all, had made a fortune as a business owner and a TV station executive, and he was worth about $10 million. But Steve knew that money could not possibly be the only thing Celeste saw in him. I mean, he knew that he took great care of Celeste, and also he took great care of her twin teenage daughters. I mean, he really helped give Celeste and her girls the stability that they desperately needed. However, despite that stability, one thing that Celeste had always struggled with for much of her life was depression. And in fact, earlier that year, it had gotten so bad that Celeste had actually tried to end her own life. And, she had failed, she'd lived, but as a result of that attempt, she'd spent a few weeks in a psychiatric hospital. Now, of course, that was a really traumatic and awful thing for the family, but from Steve's perspective, the upside of this was that Celeste was put on some new medication as a result of this hospital stay. She had made some good friends, actually, while she was at the hospital, and to Steve, it just seemed like, maybe now things were starting to maybe turn around for Celeste. And to Steve, the fact that Celeste appeared to be on the right path again was great timing, because recently, Steve had actually been dealing with health problems of his own. Twice in the past few months, Steve had passed out and actually had to be hospitalized himself. The doctors told him he had high blood pressure, sleep apnea, and he had some heart and kidney issues, but they actually couldn't quite figure out why he was fainting. They just knew he had, several symptoms going on. Now, Steve thought it was very likely stress-related, and he just needed to relax. So in fact, in 2 days from now, he was going to be taking Celeste on a 3-week vacation around Europe. After everything Celeste had been through that year, and also, Steve had been through as well with his own medical issues, he felt like they both could use some time away, just the two of them. But now, when Steve got up from his seat out on the patio of his home and he put the empty cocktail glass down on the table and he turned and he opened the glass door that led into the bedroom, he saw that even though he'd already packed his suitcase for this European trip, several days ago, Celeste's suitcase was still empty in the closet. And Steve couldn't help but feel like it seems like Celeste might be getting cold feet about this European vacation. Like she should have been packed already and she's clearly putting it off. So Steve left the bedroom and he went down the hallway and went into the kitchen where he found Celeste cleaning up. And when he got in there, as gently as he could, he told Celeste, hey, when you get a chance, you really ought to pack. And she told him, oh, don't worry about it. She'd just been busy all week. She'd get to it. Steve nodded, but wasn't really convinced that she actually intended to pack soon, but he said, okay. And then he looked over at the clock, and even though it was barely 9 p.m., he felt exhausted. So he told Celeste he was going to go to bed, and she told him that she actually intended to stay up for a bit longer. One of her daughters was having a sleepover at the family's lake house that night, and she said that she might go over there and just check on them later. Celeste told Steve that when she returned from doing that, she would sleep in a different room to avoid waking him up. Steve thanked her and gave her a kiss goodnight, and then he turned and walked back down the hallway, back into the bedroom. He got ready for bed, climbed into bed, and then he put on his oxygen mask because he had sleep apnea, and then he pulled the covers up, and he drifted off to sleep. Hours later, around 3 a.m., Steve woke up, and immediately he felt this horrible pain in his stomach. And even though it was dark in his room, he looked down, he's got the mask still on his face, and he could tell there was something on his stomach. And he reached down instinctively and he grabbed at his stomach and he felt something wet on his hands. And so in a panic, he ripped off his mask and he kind of sat up to look down at his abdomen. But as he did, just the pain he felt intensified so much just by trying to sit up that he fell back down. And so he reached over and he clicked on the light and he looked down and there was blood all over his stomach, like all over the sheets everywhere. And so he begins screaming out for Celeste. And as he's screaming, like the pain is only getting worse and worse, and Celeste is not coming in the room. She's not even responding. And so as he's looking down, like completely panic-stricken, watching all this blood coming out of his gut, he has no idea how this is happening. He just reached over and grabbed the phone and he dialed 911. Just minutes later, a squad car from the Travis County Sheriff's Department pulled up outside of Steve's house with its lights flashing. Deputy Alan Howard climbed out of that car and he saw a fire captain and another pair of deputies on the front step pounding on the door. All Deputy Howard knew was that a man in this home had called in with some kind of medical emergency. But the dispatcher had not quite understood what was wrong with him. And so Howard just ran over to the front door, and there the other deputies told him that so far nobody was answering their knocks. Howard knew at this point, time is of the essence. They had to get in and make sure this person was okay, and so he didn't want to just sit out here and wait any longer. So he left the front porch and he went along the side of the house to see if there was maybe another door that was unlocked somewhere else. And so as Howard went around to the side of the property, the other deputies followed him, and then Howard, he eventually found this flight of stairs that went up to a patio attached to a bedroom. And so up Howard went, the deputies followed, they got up there, and they looked into the house and they saw a light was on. And then through the glass door, they could all see there was an elderly man laying in bed with a telephone receiver in one hand, and his other hand appeared to be just covered in blood. Howard walked up to the door and tried to open it, but it was locked. So he pulled out his heavy-duty flashlight and he broke the glass, reached in, unlocked it, and slid the door open. Then Howard ran into the bedroom, and when he got right next to the bed, he looked at this man who was still conscious, but he had a gaping hole in his stomach, like his intestines were literally spilling out, and that's why his other hand was so covered in blood. It was like he was trying to hold his intestines inside of himself. Howard asked the guy what happened, and the old man just said he had no idea. He'd just woken up and his guts were coming out. At this point, the fire captain came into the room, and while he knelt down with his first aid kit to try to bandage up this man's wounds, Howard began looking around the bedroom for any clue about what was going on here. And he noticed something that was round and yellow lying on the carpet. So he bent down to get a better look, and he saw that the round yellow thing was a shotgun shell. And so at this point, it seemed fairly obvious that this man has been shot in the stomach with a shotgun. But Howard's also realizing that whoever pulled the trigger might still be in the house. So at this point, Howard drew his own weapon and he crept slowly out into the hallway. And as Howard began searching the rest of the house, he didn't find anybody, but what he did find is there were lots of other entry points into the home, lots of doors and windows. And eventually, when he found his way into the living room, he saw there was another set of sliding glass doors, and he walked right up to it and he found they were unlocked. Howard also saw that a table lamp in this living room was overturned, suggesting that somebody might have knocked it over while coming in or out of the house. And so Howard continued searching the living room, and then he found his way into the dining room, and then the kitchen, and then he went down a hallway into another wing of the house, and there he opened another door to a bedroom, and he found there was a woman inside, sleeping in her bed, totally sound asleep. At this point, Howard lowered the weapon, and he flipped on a light, and the woman immediately startled awake. And she was about to ask, what's going on here? But Howard just stopped her and he told her that he was with the sheriff's department and they were here responding to a 911 call. And he told her that the man in the other room was very badly injured and he had called 911. And so the woman, as she's processing what she's being told, she began sobbing hysterically and then just begged Howard not to let her husband die. And then a second later, in the midst of all this chaos, this teenage girl comes running in the room and goes right to the woman, and she grabs her the way a child would grab their mother, and they're sort of holding each other, and Deputy Howard, he's looking for potentially a shooter in the house. But just from the looks of it, it appeared very much like this is a woman who's very shocked, very shaken up by this. The girl, the teenager as well, appears equally shocked. But just to be sure, Howard asked this woman to identify herself, and through tears, she would say that her name was Celeste Beard, and that very likely the victim here, the person you're talking about, the man, is her husband, Stephen Beard. And then she also said that the teenage girl was her daughter. And so now, Howard, feeling pretty confident that these are just victims, he told them to just stay put, that he was going to search the rest of the house and just make sure that the house was safe. And so Howard, he leaves the room, he can still hear them crying behind him, and he searches the rest of the house. Huge house, but he searches every room. And there's nobody there. And so it appeared that whoever had shot Steve was gone. Around 5:30 a.m. on October 2nd, 1999, so about 2.5 hours after Steve Beard called 911, Sergeant Paul Knight walked through the waiting room at a hospital in Austin, Texas. Knight was a criminal investigator for the Travis County Sheriff's Department, and he'd been called in to lead the investigation into this shooting. Knight stopped at the front desk and he spoke to a nurse, who told him that Steve Beard was in critical condition, so questioning him would not be possible right now. Sergeant Knight nodded and gave the nurse his card and asked them to give him a call if Steve's condition ever stabilized. As Knight turned to leave, he quickly scanned the waiting room, And he saw in the corner there was a deputy speaking to a woman who appeared to be in her 30s, as well as a teenage girl. The deputy waved to Knight and called him over, and so Knight went over and he introduced himself. The woman told Knight that she was Steve's wife, Celeste, and the girl was her daughter, Christina. And Knight, he said hello to them, but he knew that he had to do something that was going to come off as pretty insensitive, but he really had to do it as soon as possible. So after just, exchanging some pleasantries, he sat down and pulled out a gunpowder residue test kit. And then he asked Celeste and Christina if he could swab their hands before they began really getting into any sort of conversation here. And Celeste looked really surprised and asked if she was a suspect. And Knight explained that really at this point, everybody was a suspect. And so swabbing them for gunpowder would be the quickest way to rule them both out. So Celeste, who was still very clearly shaken up, she just put both her hands out, and Knight ran a test strip across both of them. And then after that, Christina put her hands out and he tested her hands as well. And then he waited for the test strips to develop. And about a minute later, he confirmed that they were both negative, meaning neither of them had fired a gun recently. And so with this test out of the way, Knight's entire demeanor sort of softened, and he asked Celeste to just walk him through what had happened that night. She told him that her husband, Steve, had gone to bed around 9 or 9:30, and shortly after that, she had left their home and driven over to the family's lake house to check on her other daughter, Jennifer, and her friends who were having a sleepover there. She said the lake house was about a half an hour away, and so by the time she finally came back after checking on Jennifer and the other girls, she said it was about midnight. And, she walked in the house and it was quiet, there was nothing unusual, and she said she went straight to bed. And she said she actually chose to sleep in a different room than Steve because Steve had gone to bed earlier and she had told him she didn't want to wake him up if she came home late. And so she was doing him a courtesy by sleeping in this other room. Knight asked Celeste if she knew anybody who might be mad at her husband or who might want to hurt him for any reason, and she said no. But she did say that the previous afternoon, her husband had gone out and cashed a really big check. He was going to give some cash to her twin daughters, while she and Steve were going to be in Europe. He wanted to give the kids some spending money while they were away, and it was quite a bit of money. And so she said, maybe somebody at the bank saw him cashing that check, knew he had a bunch of money on him. Maybe they followed him home to rob him. And so Knight and Celeste spoke for a little bit longer. And then when Knight was done questioning her, Celeste got up and said she was going to go outside and smoke a cigarette. And as she left, Knight turned to her daughter, Christina, and asked her about what she'd seen and heard from the previous night. Christina said she had been asleep all night until around 3:30 in the morning when she had woken up to police lights flashing outside her window. And as she continued to tell her story of what happened, Knight noticed that she was being really careful about what she was saying. Not like she was trying to remember some concocted story, but rather it was like she was literally trying her best to actually remember. Like she was struggling to remember just what amounted to a pretty traumatic and very, chaotic night. But before Knight could ask any more follow-up questions, another girl, another teenager, who looked exactly like Christina, ran into the waiting room, and immediately Christina got up to go over and hug her. And when the two girls pulled away from each other, Knight noticed that both of these girls were sobbing, and they really were just like identical. Christina introduced this new girl as her twin sister, Jennifer. And then just a few seconds after that, two teenage boys came through the hospital door, and they hurried over to join the group. And as they all sat down, Christina explained that the two boys were her and Jennifer's boyfriends. After Christina briefly updated her sister Jennifer and the two boyfriends about the condition of her stepfather, Knight turned to Jennifer and just asked her to please walk him through where she had been, the previous night. And Jennifer would say, she had been at the family's lake house, she was there with her boyfriend and one other friend, she'd been there all night. And then when they had found out something had happened to Steve, they had all rushed here as soon as they could. And so Knight, he asked the girls if either of them knew anyone who might want to harm their stepfather. And as soon as he asked that, Knight noticed the two teenage girls, they shared this quick, knowing look between themselves. At this point, Christina turned back to Knight and said there was only one person she could think of who would do something like this, a woman named Tracy Tarleton. She explained that Tracy was a friend of her mother's, and they'd met earlier that year at a psychiatric hospital where they had both been patients. But Christina said there was just something off about their friendship. Tracy seemed like really unstable, and Christina got the feeling that she was actually in love with their mom. And as soon as she said this, all four of the teens just sort of nodded knowingly, like this was something they definitely had talked about internally. And then they all began to agree out loud that Tracy very likely was the one who did this. And then a minute later, a fifth teenager came running into the hospital and they joined the group, and Jennifer introduced her as another friend. Her name was Amy Cozart, and she had been the other friend sleeping over at the lake house that night. And Amy, who literally had just joined and heard, no context to this point about anything the other teenagers had said, when she was asked pretty much right away by Knight if she knew of anyone who might have wanted to hurt Steve, she didn't hesitate. She just said, "Oh, Tracy Tarleton." Later that afternoon, around 3 o'clock, Sergeant Knight knocked on the front door of Tracy Tarleton's very unassuming ranch-style house in a working-class part of Austin, Texas. While running a check on Tracy to confirm her address, he'd also discovered that she had a weapons permit for a 20-gauge shotgun, the same caliber as the casing that was found inside the crime scene. Tracy answered the door pretty much right away, as if she had been waiting for someone to come by. And Knight, after introducing himself, told her that Steve Beard had been shot. And when he said this, he didn't notice any shock on Tracy's face. Instead, Tracy actually looked scared. Knight asked Tracy if she had any idea who might have shot Steve. And she said no, but then she asked if she needed a lawyer. And Knight said, "Well, that's up to you." And then before she could really react to that, he asked her if he could come inside. And Tracy just sort of turned and led him into the living room. Knight walked in, he sat down, and he just continued talking to Tracy. And so he asked her about her relationship with Celeste. And she said that yes, they had met at a psychiatric hospital when they were both being treated earlier that year for suicide attempts. And then, sort of unannounced, she told the detective that at first, when she had met Celeste, her feelings towards Celeste had not been platonic. They had been romantic. She had been interested in Celeste as a partner. But she then quickly clarified and said that was in the past and that now they really were just friends. And so Knight took stock of this and didn't really ask too many follow-up questions on their relationship. And instead, he just said, "Okay, well, where were you the night before?" And Tracy said she had been here at her house the whole time. She said that she had ordered pizza and she'd had a few beers and then had just gone to bed. Knight asked her if she owned a gun. And Tracy said yes. But she only used it for skeet shooting. Knight asked if he could see her gun. And so Tracy got up and she walked over and opened up a closet and she pulled out a shotgun in a zippered case. Knight asked her if he could take her gun down to the ballistics department, and Tracy definitely hesitated for a moment, but then she was like, "Sure." Later that same day, Sergeant Knight walked through the crime scene at the Beard Mansion, looking for any clues that the investigators might have missed during the initial search. Celeste's twin daughters, Christina and Jennifer, had actually come with him to help point out anything that could be out of place that he wouldn't necessarily notice. Inside of Steve's bedroom, Knight saw that some of the drawers and closets had been left open, as if they had been ransacked by a burglar. But something about the whole scene just didn't seem right. The drawers, they didn't appear to have been ripped open as if somebody was in a rush. They had been pulled out really carefully, and inside the drawer, things were basically pretty neat. And so tonight, this didn't really appear to be a burglary. He suspected that someone might have staged the crime scene to appear to be a burglary to throw off the investigation. However, just for good measure, he asked the twin girls to look through all of these open drawers and closets to see if you can identify anything that was missing. And so the girls began looking around, and eventually Christina said that she couldn't find Stephen's watch or his sapphire ring. Now, on the one hand, this might give credit to the idea that this really was a burglary gone wrong, that Steve was just sort of in the wrong place at the wrong time and got shot by the burglar. But tonight, this development that these two small items were gone actually only seemed to confirm the idea that this was not a burglary gone wrong, because this whole house was chock full of nice jewelry and antiques. There's so many other things in the house that could have been taken that were obvious that were not taken. And so Knight, he left the bedroom, walked down the hallway, and went into the living room. And there he's looking around at all this obviously very expensive furniture and vases and paintings and all this stuff that's super valuable all over the place. He began to consider another possibility, that maybe somebody in the family had killed Steve for the inheritance. I mean, this guy clearly is loaded. Now, Knight didn't know what Steve's will said yet, but he knew that along with his two stepdaughters, he had 3 adult children from his first marriage, and all of them very likely stood to inherit millions of dollars when he died. And then there was Steve's wife, Celeste, who was less than half his age. It was hard not to wonder if she'd simply married him for his money. And so it wasn't really a far cry to wonder if maybe she had been involved in the shooting, because if he dies, maybe she'd get all of his money. And so as Knight was thinking about this and wandering back down the hallway, he noticed a trap door in the ceiling that led to an attic that he hadn't noticed before. So, curious, he reached up and pulled open the door, and then he climbed up the ladder that came down, and before long he was in the attic. And up in the attic, he saw there was a box lying on the floor just a few feet away, and, where everything else in the attic had been totally covered in dust and cobwebs, this box was not. It was perfectly clean, as if it had only been put up here pretty recently. So he grabbed the box and he opened the lid up, and inside was a 20-gauge shotgun. Knight knew this could be extremely important to this case, so he immediately packaged up the box, picked it up, and he carried it down the ladder back down to the main floor. And when he got down there, he saw one of the twin girls, Jennifer, staring at him looking really nervous. She rushed to explain that shotgun she had purchased as an anniversary gift for her boyfriend, and she was just keeping it up there out of sight until it was time to give it to him. She swore the gun had never been fired, and she had not even taken it out of the box yet. Now, Knight heard what she said, but he held on to the box because he still was going to bring it back to the ballistics department right away to have it tested. I mean, it seemed very odd to him that Jennifer hadn't mentioned until now that there was a gun in the house, and that it just happened to be the exact same gun, same caliber, as the weapon that was used to shoot Steve. Now, Jennifer did have an alibi. She had been at the lake house at that sleepover 30 miles away on the night of Steve's shooting. But her sister, Christina, had been home the whole night, and Knight had to wonder if maybe the two sisters had plotted together to kill their stepfather, maybe for his money. After all, it just seemed weirdly convenient that Jennifer, Christina, their boyfriends, their other friend Amy had all, without any hesitation, named Tracy Tarleton as the suspect. It just seemed like something here was not quite adding up. That evening, Detective Knight went back to the hospital, and the nurse at the front desk told him that Steve was out of surgery and was stable enough to finally have visitors. She gave him Steve's room number and then let him through. However, when he got down the hallway to Steve's room, he saw this handwritten sign taped to the door that said no law enforcement personnel allowed to interview patient except in the presence of his attorney. And as Knight was processing this pretty surprising sign, out of nowhere, Steve's wife, Celeste, came rushing down the hallway and literally blocked him from going into the room. She said that, for one, she was not going to allow any further searches of her and Steve's house, and if police wanted to speak to her husband, they'd have to go through the family's lawyer. And Knight, he was stunned by this, because in all his years on the force, he had never seen a victim hire a defense attorney. And then more than that, Knight wasn't even sure if Steve was the one who made this decision. Steve was stable now, but he really had no idea if he was actually conscious. Was it Steve who decided to put up this roadblock? Or was it Celeste? So at this point, Knight really didn't know what he was legally allowed to do here. And so, using an abundance of caution, he just turned around and left, at least for now. And as he, walked out of the hospital, he tried to make sense of why Celeste was suddenly being so defensive. Even if she was not the one who made this decision, the way she had just treated him in the hallway was just very aggressive. And then he began to wonder if maybe she had heard about the gun that he had found in their attic and was now trying to just protect her daughters. Or maybe she was trying to protect herself. On the afternoon of October 7th, so 5 days after Steve Beard was shot, Sergeant Paul Knight looked through a folder of interview notes at his desk. By this point, he'd spoken to all three of Steve's own children, his adult children, but they were all ruled out as suspects because they all lived hours away and had solid alibis. When Knight had asked one of Steve's sons if he knew who might have done this, he had told the detective to look into Celeste. After all, pretty much they all thought she was in this marriage for money to begin with. But, Knight had tested Celeste for gunshot residue right after the shooting, so he knew she literally could not have been the one who pulled the trigger. And so at this point, to Knight, it just sort of felt like the entire family was just pointing fingers at each other. But at the same time, Knight did feel like at least one family member on some side of the family was likely involved in the shooting. There was just frankly too much money at stake here. In particular, it was definitely suspicious that Celeste's daughter, Jennifer, had a 20-gauge shotgun in the attic. And on top of that, that she and her twin sister Christina and all of their friends had immediately pointed the finger at Tracy Tarleton. And then as for Tracy, I mean, she did have a pretty weak alibi and she did own a 20-gauge shotgun. But despite that, she had absolutely no history of doing anything violent like this. And she was remarkably cooperative and had even handed over her shotgun for analysis without really any fight at all. And so at this point, Knight knew he really just needed to speak directly to Steve. But the family's attorney was preventing the police from seeing him. And Knight wasn't sure how stable his condition was, or really how much longer he would even be alive for. So this was a very tenuous situation. But just then, Knight noticed something out of the corner of his eye. And he looked up, and he saw there was another detective in the doorway of his office, just sort of leaning there with a big smile on their face. Knight asked them what was going on, and the detective walked over and handed him a manila folder. And he told him this was a forensics report they had just gotten back. A piece of evidence that had been found at the crime scene may have just cracked the entire case. Based on forensic evidence, confessions, and witness interviews, this is what police believe happened to Steve Beard in the early morning hours of October 2nd, 1999. Around 2:30 a.m., the killer turned off their headlights as they drove toward the Beard mansion. They parked at the back entrance to the property, far away from the house, so the noise of their engine wouldn't wake anybody up inside. They got out of the car, slung a shotgun over their shoulder, and began walking through the trees towards the mansion. And as the patio came into view, they stopped. They felt sick, and they actually didn't want to go through with this, but they had made a promise. They had to do it. So they swallowed their fear and continued walking towards the mansion. And when they got right to the steps that would lead up to the patio, they went to the right and they walked to a separate door that led into the living room. That glass door was unlocked, so they opened it up, they stepped inside, and then once inside, they navigated their way to the main bedroom. And when they went inside the main bedroom, they found Steve asleep in his bed. The killer walked to the foot of the bed and just stared at Steve for a second. And then when they were ready, they raised the shotgun in their shaking hands and they pulled the trigger. And the blast was deafening. Blood began pouring out of Steve's abdomen immediately. The killer reflexively racked the shotgun, ejecting the shotgun shell, getting ready to fire a second time if need be. But then, Steve, he began fumbling for the nightstand, like he was maybe reaching for a weapon of his own. And the killer, at this point, they're reaching down on the ground, trying to find the spent shotgun shell to take that with them. But they're so scared that Steve's about to shoot them. And so they just abandon the shotgun shell. And then with their shotgun, the killer runs out of the bedroom, down the hallway, back out through the living room, back out the same door they came in, knocking that lamp over in the process. They shut the doors behind them and ran to their car. And from there, they drove to a safe location where they washed their hands, they threw their clothes into the washer, and then they very thoroughly cleaned their shotgun. And then after it was pristine again, they put the shotgun back into storage. The killer was in fact Tracy Tarleton, Celeste's friend from the hospital who all the kids had said she's the one who did this. Well, it was her. The shell that was found on Steve's floor came back from ballistics as an exact match for Tracy's shotgun. And so she was arrested on October 8th, less than a week after the shooting. And then after she was arrested, she confessed to the killing and said that ultimately she had killed Steve because she was in love with Celeste and she wanted Celeste all to herself. However, a few months later, in January of 2000, Steve actually died from his injuries. And after that, a new story began to emerge. It turned out that Tracy's love for Celeste was not one-sided. The two women had been having a full-blown affair for months before the murder. In fact, Celeste had begun secretly slipping Everclear into Steve's cocktails, which is more than twice as strong as the vodka that Steve thought he was drinking. And so basically, Celeste would get Steve really, really drunk and get him to pass out. And then once he would pass out, Celeste would go sneak off and spend the night with Tracy. According to Tracy, Celeste had asked her to kill Steve so they could be together. And so for the first few months after Tracy's arrest, Tracy kept her mouth shut about Celeste's involvement. But then 5 months after Steve died, Celeste got remarried to a man that she had just met. And that's when Tracy realized that Celeste was not really in love with her. She had been using her to get rid of Steve so she could inherit all his money. And so when this happened, Tracy was so hurt by what Celeste had done that she began telling the real truth with the authorities. And eventually, she agreed to testify against Celeste. And so based on Tracy's testimony, Celeste was arrested on March 28, 2002. She was eventually found guilty of Steve's murder and sentenced to life in prison. Tracy was also convicted of murder, but because of her cooperation, her sentence was reduced to just 20 years, and she was actually released on parole in 2011. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, MrBallen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen, produced by Jeremy Bone and Cole Lacasio. This episode was written by Kate Gallagher. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, Camille Callahan, Alex Paul, Ben Fasciano. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Jordan Stidham. Production support by Antonio Minata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song, Something Wicked, by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. And just a reminder, every new and exclusive episode we put out on the MrBallen podcast, you can also now watch on the MrBallen YouTube channel that very same day. And trust me, some of these stories you truly have to see to believe. Again, my YouTube channel is just called MrBallen. If you want to listen to episodes 1 week early and ad-free, you can subscribe to SiriusXM Podcast Plus on Apple Podcasts or visit SiriusXM.com/Podcast Plus to listen with Spotify or another app of your choice. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Today's podcast will feature 3 stories that make you realize not everything is as it seems. The audio from all 3 of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called On the Prowl, and it's about a local urban legend that quickly turns into a full-blown nightmare. The second story you'll hear is called Call Your Mother, and it's about a mother who is devastated after her son disappears. And the third and final story you'll hear is called The Red Ghost, and it's about this horrifying creature that terrorized people for years on the Arizona frontier. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So, if that's of interest to you, please invite the follow button to come on an all-expenses-paid trip to Venice, Italy with you. But the second you're both in a gondola, push them into a canal. Okay, let's get into our first story called On the Prowl. On the night of October 20th, 2021, 2 young couples were hanging out inside of a little home in the woods in Henderson County, North Carolina. The couples were Rachel and her fiancé Chris, and their friends Autumn and Jake, whose home it was. Rachel and Autumn were in the kitchen preparing to dye Rachel's hair over the sink. Jake and Chris were in the living room discussing the very strange sightings of a black panther that had been reported all over town in recent days. So, North Carolina does have big cats, including panthers. After all, their professional football team is named the Carolina Panthers. However, the panthers in North Carolina are typically of the brownish color, not the pitch black variety like the panther that was apparently prowling all over Henderson County in recent days. Nonetheless, Chris was absolutely convinced that he had seen this black panther about a week ago when he was out walking his and Rachel's new puppy. He swore the panther had been following him in the tree line around his property, and he had been afraid it was thinking about attacking his dog. Ever since, he told Jake he'd been nervous walking around his property outside, and so he'd begun to carry a gun for protection. Jake was in the middle of telling Chris that he too was now carrying a gun around for the same reason when they were interrupted by Rachel calling for Chris from the kitchen. Jake and Chris got up off the couch and walked into the kitchen, where Rachel told them that she'd been trying to show Autumn a YouTube video about how to dye hair at home when her phone had died. And so she asked Chris if he wouldn't mind going back to their apartment and getting her a phone charger. Now, obviously, Chris was not thrilled about going into the woods at night, with this panther roaming around, but he loved his fiancée and would do anything for her, and he had his gun, so he said he would go. And as Chris headed to the door to leave, Jake said, "Hold on a minute." He grabbed his flashlight and grabbed his gun and told Chris he would tag along and watch his buddies back. The two guys said they'd be back in a minute, and then they walked out the door. A light wind rustled the leaves of the trees as Jake and Chris set out on the little path that connected their two homes. They both stayed absolutely quiet as they walked because they wanted to make sure they could hear any indication of this panther being nearby. But all they could hear was the wind, some crickets, and an owl hooting in the distance. But about halfway down the path, Chris suddenly heard something coming from the woods and instinctively shot out his hand to stop Jake in his tracks. They both froze, and then Jake raised his flashlight and shined it at the underbrush where Chris was saying he had heard noise. And for a second, all they saw were green leaves. But then, two eyes opened up and reflected back at them. The two men gasped and instinctively reached for their guns, but before they had to draw and do anything, this creature emerged from the underbrush, and it was just a raccoon. Chris and Jake laughed in relief, and then continued walking down the path to Chris's house. They went inside, got Rachel's charger, and then they left and stepped back into the woods. But now, as Chris and Jake walked along this dark path, something just felt different. The crickets seemed to have gotten quieter and the wind had picked up. The owl that had been hooting before must have flown away because it was now strangely quiet, except for the sound of their footsteps and the wind in the trees. They were about 40 feet away from Jake's house when they suddenly heard a twig snap to their left. And so the two men turned to face the noise, and as they did, they heard another sound, a low, raspy growl. And so Jake aimed his flashlight at the bush where these noises had come from, and this time it was obvious it was not a raccoon, because the bushes were literally shaking like some enormous animal was inside of them. And so the two men looked at each other with wide eyes, and without saying a word, they both knew they were thinking the same thing. It's the panther. And so the two men drew their guns and they aimed it at the bush, hoping that this thing would just take off back into the woods, but it didn't. The bush continued to shake like whatever it was gonna leap out. And so the men just opened fire, and they kept on shooting until they heard a new horrible sound. And the second they heard it, they dropped their guns. It would turn out that was not a panther. After Chris and Jake had left the house, Rachel and Autumn decided to pull a prank. They had found some expired eggs in the fridge, and they had decided they would go hide in the bushes near that pathway and pelt the guys with them. When Rachel saw Chris and Jake approaching, she tried to crouch down lower in the bush so as not to be seen, but as she did, she stepped on a twig. And at the same time, in anticipation of their prank, the women started to laugh. They tried to stifle their laughter, but that only made them snort and shake the bushes. And that combination of noises, the snapped twig, the stifled laughter, which sort of resembled a short raspy growl, and the shaking bushes, signaled to the guys that this was no prank. This was the panther, and if they didn't act, it might attack them. And so they drew their guns, and they began to shoot, until they heard Autumn scream out in horror. Tragically, by the time they had stopped shooting, it was already too late for Rachel. She had been shot to death. Law enforcement did an investigation into the shooting, and they declared it was just a horrible accident. Everybody was sober, and the two men were carrying their weapons legally. And so no one was ever charged with Rachel's death. And to this day, no one has ever gotten solid evidence that that Black Panther even exists. Our next story is called Call Your Mother. On the morning of September 15th, 2016, an 80-year-old widow named Rita Wolfenson shuffled her way into her kitchen inside of her brick home in Brooklyn, New York. However, Rita was basically blind, and as she made her way into the kitchen, she walked past her table and her foot caught a basket of newspapers in the ground, and it caused her to stumble and fall to the floor. And the second she hit the ground, she heard a pop. And the second she heard that pop, she felt a shooting pain in her hip, and she knew right away, very likely her hip was broken. Now, of course, this is a huge problem if you break your hip, but for Rita in particular, this was a very, very serious problem. I mean, this was potentially life and death, and she knew it, and she also knew the reason this was so serious was all her fault. Rita lived completely alone and basically had cut off everybody in her life. For like 20 years, she had not interacted with virtually anybody in her life, by choice. And basically the reason for this all started 20 years earlier with her beloved son, Louis, who lived with her. But for some reason, 20 years ago, so basically right at the time when she cut off her whole family and all her friends, her son Louis just kind of inexplicably packed up and left her house without saying anything, and then she never heard from him again. And so suddenly losing her son for reasons unknown sent Rita into this spiraling depression, and the way she coped with it was basically cutting off the entire world around her, and she just lived in this house, totally isolated, totally alone. And so now here she is, stuck on the kitchen floor with a broken hip, unable to get up or call for help, and nobody is going to come by to help her. Nobody even knows she's in trouble, she's all alone. But despite basically being blind and knowing she's in this horrible situation, somewhere deep down, Rita finds this inner strength. She knows that if she's going to survive this, she has to save herself. And so she kind of rolled over onto her other side, despite the pain in her hip throbbing the whole time. She got herself onto her elbows, and she began low-crawling her way towards the coffee table in the living room that was right near the kitchen. And she finally got over there. The whole time she's got this horrible pain on her side. She gets to the table, she reaches up, and she grabs her phone, which she basically never used because she didn't talk to anybody or take any phone calls, but she managed to get the receiver off the cradle, and she dialed 911. And so a few minutes later, the ambulance arrives at Rita's house, they come in, they find Rita, she's still on the ground, they scoop her up, they put her in the ambulance, and they go to the hospital. And when they get there, very quickly, they put Rita through a bunch of scans and tests, and they confirm, what Rita was already expecting, which is, her hip is broken. However, after telling her about the fact that her hip was broken, the nurses and doctors told Rita that, you're going to have to stay here for surgery, but then after you get out of surgery, you can't just go home. You're legally blind, you're very frail, and you don't live with anyone, and you nearly died from falling on your kitchen floor because had you not been able to reach your phone, you would have starved to death. And so they told Rita that what she would need to do is move into an assisted living home where basically nurses and a medical team would be able to care for her on a day-to-day basis. Basically, she wasn't going to be allowed to move back into her beloved home where she'd spent her whole life. And for Rita, this news was just unbelievably devastating. I mean, not only because that was her home, that's where she spent all her time, but also because it was the last place she had been before Louis had left inexplicably. I mean, 20 years later, she's still dealing with the trauma of losing her son. And that house was kind of like the last memory of her son. I mean, his bedroom had basically been untouched since he left because she was so holding on to his memory. And so after the nurses and doctors left, Rita was left in the room all alone, kind of unsure what to do, and it dawned on her she would need to do something that for 20 years she had completely avoided doing. She would need to call her family. So she grabbed the phone, and she still remembered the number of her younger brother, Joseph, and so she called Joseph up. Now, the reason she called Joseph is, over the past 20 years, the one family member who had basically tried really hard to stay in touch with Rita after she cut everybody off was Joseph. And so she figured if there was anybody in her family who would not judge her for the silence and, being cut off, it would be Joseph. And so a couple of seconds later, a phone rang inside of a house pretty far away from the hospital, but still in New York. And this was Joseph's house, and he was sitting on the couch reading a book, and his wife was in the kitchen doing her thing. And Joseph, he answers the phone, and when he hears Rita's voice, he couldn't believe it. He was shocked to hear her after so many years, but immediately the feeling he had was relief. He and his sister, before, Louis had left and kind of destroyed Rita's life, Joseph and his older sister had been very close, and it had really broken his heart when Rita had cut him off. I mean, he felt like if there was one person that Rita would have stayed in touch with, it would have been him. But he didn't judge her, he was ready to hear whatever she had to say, because obviously something big had to have happened for her to call him. And so he asked her, what's going on? What's going on? And Rita would explain, she fell and she needs help. And Joseph was like, I will be there as soon as I possibly can. And also I'll have my wife swing by your house to grab, your toothbrush and some toiletries and a couple of things from home to make your stay at the hospital a bit better. But we're going to get through this. I'll be there as soon as I can. A few hours later, as Joseph was making his way to the hospital to see Rita, Joseph's wife was on her way to Rita's house to pick up her things. And so she pulled up in front of the house and she looked up at the big brick house and it looked the same as it had, 10, 20 years ago. She made her way up to the door. She didn't knock because she knew nobody was home. And so she used the key that Joseph gave her. She unlocked the door. She opened it up and immediately she was hit with this horrible smell. So Rita was basically a hoarder, and so she had lots of, plates of food and all this stuff just kind of jammed inside of her house, and it was all rotting, and so her house really smelled horrible. Not to mention, Rita basically never went outside. Remember, she kind of was a hermit for the past 20 years. And so Joseph's wife was kind of bracing for a pretty disgusting living situation, but this was far more repulsive than even she had braced for. But she knew she had a job to do, get in there and get some things for Rita, and so she kind of began breathing through her mouth only to avoid the smell, and so she stepped into the house, which again, was piled high on either side of the hallway with newspapers and just kind of junk, and so she began walking through the house, and she eventually turned toward a flight of stairs. She went up to the second floor, and the second floor is the same as the first floor. There's plates of food and junk and all this stuff, and she didn't know which bedroom was Rita's, so she just went to the first door that she saw, and she opened it up, kind of hoping that maybe this would be Rita's bedroom. But the second she opened up that door, not only was she hit with more horrible smells, but she saw something in this room that she was not braced for, something that terrified her to the point where she shut the door, turned around, and sprinted out of the house practically screaming, and then as soon as she was outside, she dialed 911. It would turn out Rita's understanding of what actually transpired 20 years earlier with Louis inexplicably leaving, the event that basically caused Rita to shut down and cut her whole family off, her understanding of that was totally wrong. Rita had always believed that her son had just kind of stopped loving her or didn't like her anymore or something, like there was some sort of falling out, and that's why he just kind of packed up his stuff and left without even saying goodbye. But that wasn't true. Louis loved his mother. He didn't just randomly abandon her, but 20 years earlier, when Louis was 29 years old, while he was still living with Rita in her house, he died somewhat unexpectedly from natural causes. It's believed he had some sort of terminal illness that he may or may not have known about, and it's unclear if he even communicated that he was sick or that he had this illness to his mom. And so 20 years earlier, he went into his bedroom one night and he passed away in his bed. And his mother, Rita, instead of going into his bedroom and checking on him, just didn't go into his bedroom and instead convinced herself that her son must have abandoned her because he didn't love her anymore, and it sent her into this spiraling depression and she cut off her whole family, when in reality, Louis had never left her house. He was still laying in his bed upstairs all those 20 years. And so when Joseph's wife went into Rita's house and went into that first bedroom she saw on the second floor, what she saw was Louis's skeleton, still wearing a shirt and pants, laying in his bed, obviously deceased, and that's why she went running out of the house and called 911. And so in a very bizarre and morbid way, it was this discovery by Joseph's wife that would ultimately bring Rita back together again with her family. The next and final story of today's episode is called The Red Ghost. On a spring afternoon in 1883, a young woman named Sarah tidied up her farmhouse in a tiny settlement called Eagle Creek in Arizona. While Sarah cleaned, her sister Elizabeth took a bucket outside to get water from their outdoor spring. So Sarah and Elizabeth actually lived together in this farmhouse along with their respective families. The American West at this time was sparsely populated and dangerous, so it was not uncommon for families to kind of band together like this. Their husbands herded the sheep and worked the land, while Sarah and Elizabeth looked after the house and also took care of their collective 4 kids. And so on this day, as Elizabeth was out getting water, Sarah continued to tidy up the house with one eye on the kids, making sure they were okay, when all of a sudden, the family's dogs who were leashed up outside began barking really aggressively. Now for Sarah, this was really alarming because the dogs typically were pretty docile and didn't make a lot of noise. So clearly something was going on outside. And so Sarah told the kids to stay inside, and she quickly went outside onto the porch to see what the dogs were barking at. And so once Sarah was out on that porch, she immediately surveyed the area out in front of her, and off to her left and off to her right was just rocky scrubland, and then right in front of their house was this big sandy hill that kind of obscured their view off into the distance. And the dogs, who were leashed up right in front of the property out in the front yard, they were all looking right at that hill and barking at it. At first, Sarah couldn't understand what the dogs were even barking at. I mean, she looked around a few more times to see if she was missing anything, but there was nothing happening out here. But then, as Sarah continued to stare at this hill where the dogs were still barking, she suddenly saw this huge creature emerge over the top and begin coming down the hill in her direction. It was this massive four-legged creature with red fur, and its back was all twisted up, and on the back of this creature was this man. Except it was not a normal-looking man. His face was horrible and sunken, and his mouth was in this huge grin. And as she stared at him in total shock and disbelief, she saw he was missing eyes. Now, Sarah was a deeply religious person, and so as she's watching this creature being ridden on by this person come charging towards her, all she could think was, this is the devil. The devil is riding on this red creature, and it's coming to get me and my family. And so instinctively, she just turned, bolted inside the house, barricaded the door with the kitchen table, and then rounded up the 4 kids and sat in the kitchen, huddled over them, praying to God to save them from the devil. But as she was doing this, Sarah suddenly heard this blood-curdling scream come from somewhere outside. And she knew it sounded way too human of a scream to be coming from the devil or the creature it was riding on. And then she remembered her sister was out there getting water. That scream almost certainly came from her sister. But Sarah was so scared, she couldn't move. And she had these 4 kids to look after. And so instead of going out to try to save her sister, she just held the kids closer and continued to pray, hoping her sister would survive. Hours later, Sarah was still inside the barricaded house, clutching the children, praying, and her sister Elizabeth had not made another sound. And she had not come back to the house. So she's been gone for hours at this point. And Sarah feels horrible. All she wants to do is go out there and find her sister, but she just feels like she can't leave her kids, and she knows the devil is out there, so she can't go out there. But just then, she hears footsteps out on the porch, and then she hears the sound of the doorknob turning and then bumping up against the barricade. And Sarah immediately thinks, it's the devil. The devil's come back. And so she screams, and the kids are screaming. But then on the other side of the door, Sarah hears the sound of 2 familiar voices. It was the sound of her and Elizabeth's husbands. They had come back from herding the sheep, and they're calling into her like, hey, what's going on here? Let us in. And so this huge wave of relief came over Sarah. She rushed to the door, she got rid of the barricade, flung it open, and immediately began sobbing and telling these men about what had happened, about the devil, about hearing that scream, which she believed was Elizabeth. And oh, by the way, Elizabeth is still not back yet, no idea what happened to her. And so the 2 husbands are immediately so concerned. They have no idea about the validity of the story, but Elizabeth is gone. They have to go find her. And so the 2 men, they grab their guns and lanterns, and they head off towards the outdoor spring to hopefully find Elizabeth. And so the 2 men, they began making their way down this path towards the spring. And at first they were walking, kind of keeping their composure, but quickly as they're calling out for Elizabeth and not getting a response, they just took off running. And as they turned the corner and they finally saw the spring, they also saw Elizabeth. And she was face down on the ground with blood all around her. She was dead. And so as Elizabeth's husband wept over Elizabeth's body, Sarah's husband rode off into town to get the local coroner to come out and investigate to see what happened to Elizabeth. The only thing that seemed fairly obvious about Elizabeth's death, at least to the 2 husbands, was that Elizabeth looked like she had been trampled to death. There were all these hoof prints all around her when they found her. And so the coroner, he comes out and he looks at the scene, he sees Elizabeth, and he agrees that it looks like she was trampled to death. However, when he examined the hoof prints that were all over the place, they were way too big to be a horse's hoof print. And so the coroner literally said, I can't say she died by being trampled by a horse. This was not a horse. And so the coroner wound up speaking to Sarah, who would tell him all about, how the devil came over the hill on this big 4-legged creature that was all red, and she heard the scream, which must have been Elizabeth, and so the devil has trampled her sister to death. That's what happened. Now, the coroner agreed with Sarah that very likely her sister had been trampled to death by something gigantic. However, he didn't believe the actual details of Sarah's story. He did not believe that the devil killed Elizabeth. And so ultimately, because the coroner just couldn't be sure what actually happened to her, he wound up listing Elizabeth's cause of death as just unknown. But the coroner's doubts did not stop the story of the devil from spreading. Before long, basically everybody on the Arizona frontier had heard about the devil and the strange creature he rode, to the point where they were given a nickname. Together, they were called the Red Ghost. Still, most people who heard this story didn't really believe it actually happened. They figured it was kind of a joke or maybe an exaggeration, just sort of lore passed around town. But over the next few years following Elizabeth's death, sightings of the so-called red ghost became much more frequent and more strange. Many campers claim to have seen the red ghost trotting through the Arizona wilderness. In fact, some of these people claim that in the middle of the night, the red ghost would appear and trample on their tents. One cowboy claimed he got close enough to the red ghost that he was able to actually lasso its neck. However, the red ghost, in turn, took off so quickly and so powerfully that the cowboy got dragged and had to let go. And so stories like these, run-ins with the red ghost out in the wild, persisted for years, until about a decade after Elizabeth's death, this farmer in eastern Arizona happened to look out his window, and there, standing in his turnip patch, was the so-called red ghost. And this farmer had heard all the stories about the red ghost, and he had already made up his mind about what he would do if he ever ran into the red ghost, and that would be to shoot it. And so what did he do? He grabbed his rifle, he leaned out the window, and he fired. The red ghost crumpled to the ground right in the middle of the turnip patch. Once the creature was down, the farmer rushed outside and ran up to the carcass to finally see what the heck the red ghost was, what was causing all these stories to spread over so many years. And when he got out there and actually looked down at the red ghost, he knew immediately that all the stories about this creature had been wrong. It would turn out the red ghost was not the devil riding some supernatural monster. Instead, the red ghost was a combination of two very mortal beings. The first of these two beings was a creature that, if you saw it today, you would know what it was. But for folks in Arizona in the late 1800s, they would have no way of knowing what this creature was. They had never seen it before. It had red fur, a long neck, and a humped back. It was a camel. It had been brought to the United States from the Mediterranean to help haul supplies through the western frontier, and it had escaped captivity. But this camel alone was not responsible for scaring the people of Arizona. What terrified the people of Arizona and created the legend of the red ghost was the rider of the camel. When Sarah saw the rider on the camel, at first she thought it was a person. But when she looked more closely, she saw they didn't have eyes and they had this disgusting toothy grin. They just couldn't be human to her. And so she had decided this must be the devil. But it would turn out her first instinct was right. This was a person. There was a person on the back of that camel. The devil on the back of the camel was a man's decomposing corpse. And because he was a decomposing corpse, his flesh and eyes had rotted from his face, making it look like he had no eyes and gave him this huge toothy grin because there was no flesh there. Now, we don't know who this man was or how exactly he died. All we know is at some point he was riding this camel escaped, he died, and somehow didn't fall off, and his dead body remained in an upright seated position on this camel. And then this camel just roamed around Arizona for years with this corpse on its back, giving the impression that it was the devil riding on a monster. Today, the red ghost remains a local legend in Arizona. In fact, there's even a permanent statue of the camel in a small Arizona town called Quartzsite. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, MrBallen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen, produced by Jeremy Bone, research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio, Jordan Stidham, and Cole Lacasio. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Minata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. And just a reminder, every new and exclusive episode we put out on the MrBallen podcast, you can also now watch on the MrBallen YouTube channel that very same day. And trust me, some of these stories you truly have to see to believe. Again, my YouTube channel is just called MrBallen. If you want to listen to episodes 1 week early and ad-free, you can subscribe to SiriusXM Podcast Plus on Apple Podcasts or visit SiriusXM.com/Podcast Plus to listen with Spotify or another app of your choice. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Today's podcast will feature 3 stories that will make you wonder how many monsters you may have encountered in your life. The audio from all 3 of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called Mercy Road, and it's about a sinister secret that is hiding inside of a nightly news report. The second story you'll hear is called The Woman in a Wrinkled Dress, and it's about a Border Patrol officer who searches for a dangerous criminal at the Canadian border. And the third and final story you'll hear is called Striking a Discord, and it's about how the line between fantasy and reality is blurred for a group of online gamers. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please adjust the Amazon Music follow button's power seats inside of their car to a very uncomfortable position and then rip out the fuse. Okay, let's get into our first story called Mercy Road. On the evening of December 29, 1986, a California Highway Patrol officer named Craig Pyre drove his cruiser down Interstate 15 in San Diego, California. With him was an NBC News reporter in the back seat, and there was a cameraman in the passenger seat. They were filming a segment about highway travel safety that was set to air on the evening news later that night. Officer Pyre was following his typical patrol route, but after a few minutes, they passed by a sign that said Mercy Road. It was an exit. And at that point, Officer Pyre turned to the news team, pointed at Mercy Road, and said, "That's where they found the body." So a little more than 36 hours earlier, at around 4 a.m. the previous morning, a 20-year-old college student named Kara Knott had been found strangled to death in a creek right near the Mercy Road exit. Kara had been on her way home from her boyfriend's house when, for whatever reason, maybe car troubles or maybe she was trying to help someone, but she wound up in that cul-de-sac, and then while she was there, she clearly encountered someone dangerous who took her life. And so this was actually why the California Highway Patrol and NBC News were collaborating on this news segment, because Kara's killer was still not caught. And so the idea behind this segment was basically to tell drivers along this highway, how to stay safe while they were out there, especially if for whatever reason they had to stop somewhere along the highway, what to do in that situation. And so as Officer Pyre passed by the Mercy Road exit and continued down Interstate 15, he turned to the news crew, and as they filmed, he began talking about the basics of highway travel safety. Specifically, he said, look, one of the most hazardous things that can happen to you beyond an accident on the highway is if you have some sort of car trouble that forces you to stop on the highway. Because once you stop, there's an inclination for a lot of people to want to leave their vehicle, but that's a very dangerous thing to do. Officer Pyre also warned people not to get into a stranger's car, because there was a running theory at this point that perhaps Kara had gotten into her killer's car. As this particular segment was filmed, Officer Pyre was looking ahead, and he noticed there was a car pulled over on the shoulder of the highway with its hazards on. So he turned to the news crew and basically said, look, here's a chance for us to actually show the people in real time what to do in case your car breaks down on the highway. So he pulled his cruiser over right behind the stalled car, he got out, and then gestured for the news crew to come with him. Officer Pyre walked over to the passenger side door of this car, and through the open window, he asked the driver to get out and talk to him. The driver did, and as the camera rolled, Officer Pyre asked him to explain, what's going on here, what happened to your car. The driver said he had run out of gas and then gotten stranded on the side of the road. And then he had left his car and walked to a gas station to get a gas can, came all the way back, he put the gas into his car, but his car still wouldn't start. Now, at this point, Officer Pyre is realizing that this driver is doing basically exactly what he shouldn't be doing, according to the safety tips Officer Pyre had given. And so on camera, he basically says to this guy, do you understand how dangerous it is to have left your car like that and walked alone on this highway? Do you understand what a hazard that is? And the driver just kind of looked at him and shrugged yeah, I guess so. After that, Officer Pyre called the man a tow truck. His car was towed and the man was on his way. And Officer Pyre got back into the cruiser with the news crew and they carried on. After that, Officer Pyre and the news crew wrapped up filming, and then after he dropped them back off again, they told him what time to expect his segment to air on NBC that night. And sure enough, that evening, Officer Pyre was in front of a TV as the broadcast started. And when Officer Pyre's actual segment aired on TV, to him and to the California Highway Patrol, it went great. It was a minute and a half long. It sort of hit all the high points. It showed Officer Pyre, talking about how to be safe on the highway and talking to the stranded motorist. It kind of did exactly what they expected it to do. And when it was over, Officer Pyre clicked off the TV and didn't think much about it because it was not a big deal. It was just a basic safety video. And for the vast majority of other people who watched this clip live on TV, it really didn't stand out to them. Again, it was just kind of a routine police safety video. But there were a few people, when they watched this clip, that noticed something very specific. And within an hour of this clip airing on TV, those few people were calling the police in droves to tell them, we know what happened to Kara Knott. And the police would follow up on these tips, and sure enough, just over 2 weeks later, they had gathered enough evidence that they were able to arrest Kara Knott's killer. It would turn out all the clues the police needed to solve the Kara Knott murder case were right there in that 1.5 minute long video. Because what happened to Kara had almost happened to over 24 other women in San Diego. And those young women were the ones who saw the news segment when it happened live, and they noticed this particular detail that clearly telegraphed who Kara's killer was. They were the ones who called police. On the night of Kara's murder, December 27, 1986, she pulled off Interstate 15 on the Mercy Road exit, and she came to a stop in that cul-de-sac. Now, we don't know exactly why she came to a stop in there, but either way, she was there, and that's where she encountered her killer. Now, the other 24 women who encountered the same person, the killer, they were terrorized and kind of tortured and held hostage for a couple of hours, but eventually were let go. But Kara wasn't. During her encounter, at some point, the killer clubbed her over the head and then strangled her to death with a rope. Now, the killer, at first, had gotten away with this, until they were featured on that 1.5 minute long video. And some of those women who had survived their attack, they're watching the segment, and suddenly their attacker is on TV. Now, they had previously reported their attack to police, but to this point, nothing had been done. And now they're staring at, for sure, the person who attacked them, who's right on TV. And critically, as part of this segment, they're hearing about how this other young woman had been attacked and killed on this highway. And they're thinking, oh, this person did that to me. I barely got away. I bet they killed this girl. And on top of that, as they're watching the news, staring at their attacker, they can see there's a fresh cut over their eye. And so put that all together and they thought, boom, that's the person who killed Kara Knott. And sure enough, the police would follow up on these tips and they would confirm that the man in the video with the cut over his eyebrow was Kara's killer. And Kara's killer was none other than Officer Craig Pyre. Officer Pyre was found guilty of murder and sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. Since being incarcerated, he has gone up for parole 2 separate times and been rejected both times. However, he is up for parole again in 2027. Our next story is called The Woman in a Wrinkled Dress. On a late winter afternoon in 1985, a Canadian border security guard stood at the border between New York State and Ontario, Canada. And as he looked out at the dozens of cars lined up at his checkpoint, he felt an enormous amount of responsibility. Because for him, working at border security was not just about checking people's passports. It was also about making sure dangerous criminals from the United States did not flee their country and enter Canada. And today, there was one particular dangerous criminal from the United States that this guard was on high alert for, a 30-year-old man named Alex Mangle. A few days earlier, Alex Mangle had been stopped by a police officer near New York City. And during this traffic stop, Alex had somehow taken the police officer's gun and shot the officer in the head, killing them, and then Alex had fled and he was still on the run. And so now law enforcement was concerned that because New York was only 6 hours from the Canadian border, that it was very possible that Alex might try to flee into Canada to escape persecution. And so US and Canadian law enforcement and border security were on the lookout for Alex Mangle. And he was this 30-year-old white man with thinning brown hair and a wispy mustache. And so all day long, that Canadian border security guard looked very closely at every person who came through his checkpoint to see if they were Alex Mangle. He would see a family on their way to visit relatives in Canada. He would see a couple on their honeymoon. He would see a man with a car full of camping supplies and a middle-aged woman traveling alone and all these different people from all walks of life. But none of them looked anything like Alex Mangle. And so by the end of his shift, after checking dozens and dozens of cars and looking at every person, he felt certain that Alex Mangle had not slipped through his checkpoint. And so he clocked out and he went home. A few days later, on March 2nd, a police officer was patrolling this parking lot right outside of a shopping mall in Ontario, Canada, which was located about an hour and a half away from the border. And during his patrol, at some point, he noticed there was this one car, a white Toyota, that had been loitering in the area for quite a while. And so he decided to drive over and see what was going on. And when he got there, he looked inside the vehicle and he saw someone sitting on the passenger seat. And he was a white man, probably in his 30s, with thinning brown hair and a wispy mustache. And this officer immediately recognized this guy as being the wanted criminal, Alex Mangle. And so the officer immediately called for backup, and then he parked his car, got out, and approached the white Toyota where this guy was sitting with his gun drawn. And as the officer approached the passenger side door, the man inside turned, noticed the officer, jumped into the driver's seat, fired up the car, and the Toyota sped out of the parking lot. And so the officer, he jumps back in his cruiser and he takes off after him. And before long, it was like the entirety of the police force in Toronto was a part of this high-speed chase to catch this guy. And eventually they funneled the car into a dead-end street, and the white Toyota crashed into a stop sign, and then the man inside with the mustache and the thinning brown hair pops out, and immediately everybody sees, yep, that's Alex Mangle. He didn't put up a fight at that point. He was taken into custody. However, despite how relieved law enforcement was to have this cop killer in custody, they realized they didn't understand something. How was it that Alex Mangle got past border security and got into Canada? Everybody was on high alert looking for him. What happened? And so police were baffled until they searched that white Toyota Alex had been driving. On the night that Alex shot and killed that police officer near New York City, he immediately fled to this wooded area and hid out overnight. And then the next day, when he got up, he was walking around and he happened to pass by this commercial building. And as he was looking at it, he saw this middle-aged woman, whose name was Beverly Capone, come out of the building and make her way towards her car. And she was all alone. And so Alex walked up to her and abducted her at gunpoint. And then he drove her to this cabin out in the woods that he knew would be totally isolated. No one was there. And once they got there, he murdered her. And then once she was dead, he stole her clothes and put it on, and also cut off her face and her scalp and put those on as well. He was literally wearing her skin and hair. And he hopped in that white Toyota and he drove up to the Canadian border. And amazingly, he got through the checkpoint into Canada without anybody noticing. It would turn out that Canadian border security guard who all day was checking for Alex Mangle did actually see Alex Mangle. He just didn't recognize him because Alex Mangle was wearing Beverly Capone's face, hair, and clothes. And so he thought he was just a middle-aged woman traveling alone, and he let him on through. And so police would figure this whole thing out when they searched that white Toyota, because they would find lying on the floorboard was Beverly's dress, scalp, and face. Alex was deported back to the US. However, before he could stand trial, he attempted to escape a prison transport and in the process got shot to death by police. However, that was not the end of Alex's story. Following his death, officers continued to investigate him and also his property, and at some point during a search of his property, they would discover all these photos of unidentified women, along with these maps where these very isolated places in New York and Pennsylvania were circled, and nobody knows what they mean. Now, police have not conclusively linked Alex to any other murders, but he does remain a suspect in several cases, and in fact, many investigators believe Alex was actually a serial killer. However, we'll probably never know how many people Alex actually killed because he took all of his secrets to the grave. The next and final story of today's episode is called Striking a Discord. At 3:30 p.m. on July 27, 2019, a 22-year-old college student named Nicole logged onto her gaming computer in her bedroom in North Carolina. Nicole had spent the morning and the early part of the afternoon studying, but now she could finally kick back and relax and play her favorite video game, an online multiplayer combat game called Perfect World, where people battled each other as characters inspired by Chinese mythology. Perfect World was a pretty niche game, so not a whole lot of people played it or even knew about it, but Nicole loved it, and she played it basically every day for the past few years, was totally hooked on it, and in playing it, she had met about a dozen other people from all over the world who also were obsessed with this game. And together, they had formed a virtual community, and they used a messaging app called Discord to communicate with each other outside of the game. So, on this particular day, after Nicole loaded up Perfect World, she also opened up her Discord chat, and she saw already that several of her friends were online, and they were all talking on the general chat inside of their server. And so Nicole began perusing the messages, and she saw the general theme of the messages being passed was about one of the other users on their server, somebody who went by the username Menhaz. So as far as everyone knew on this Discord server, Menhaz, they didn't know his real name, was a college student, and he was basically known to be a huge troll, which meant he said and did really offensive things, in particular on this Discord server, just to get people's reactions. Because of his trolling behavior, he had actually been previously kicked out of the server and also kicked out of the game Perfect World, like the game they're all connected on this Discord server through. He had been booted from both of those platforms in the past, but in previous occasions when that happened, Menhaz would plead his case and say he's not going to do it anymore, he's going to behave, and eventually the moderators would just let him back in. And so currently, Menhaz was back on the Discord server, and he was back to his trolling ways. But as Nicole scanned through the general chat and went back and actually saw what Menhaz had been saying that day that basically had stirred up everybody else on the server to say, look, he's back to his trolling ways, when she went back and actually saw what Menhaz was saying, Nicole couldn't help but feel like today's trolling just felt different. Menhaz was talking about this apparently brilliant 4-step plan he had that was going to completely revolutionize his life and basically set him up for big success in his life going forward. However, this plan he was talking about, this 4-step plan, was not only totally outrageous, but just seemed impossible. Like what he was saying he was going to do just didn't seem possible even by Menhaz's standards. Like within his trolling standards, this was a bridge too far. This isn't even trolling, this is just weird what you're proposing. And so basically the chatter on the Discord server this day that Nicole was seeing was how nobody believed this 4-step plan was a real thing. Like this is just classic Menhaz trolling. And Nicole too, she also did not believe this plan was serious. She did not think for a second Menhaz was going to do this. And so she just kind of rolled her eyes, ignored Menhaz, minimized the Discord server, and just enjoyed playing the game, Perfect World. And after a while, after, a couple of battles that she won and a couple of battles that she lost in this game, she paused for a second and noticed there was a whole bunch of new notifications on their Discord server. And so because Nicole was already taking a break from the game, she opened up the Discord server to see what was going on. And right away she saw the main topic of discussion was once again Menhaz and his 4-step plan, but specifically, Menhaz had just sent a picture through the Discord server that apparently represented completing step 1 of this 4-step plan. He basically said, look, I did it. I've done 1. I'm on to step 2 now. And everybody's looking at this picture thinking, wait a minute, he's actually doing this? This can't be real. And Nicole, when she looked at this picture, she too thought like, no way, this is not possible. He did not do this. And in fact, our first thought was, okay, maybe this image was, created by AI or something, or, maybe he pulled this image off a website somewhere and is pretending it's authentic, but it can't possibly be something he actually took a picture of. He couldn't have done this. And so pretty quickly, Nicole, despite seeing this image, she agreed with the consensus that Menhaz is still just trolling us. This picture is not proof that he's really doing this 4-step plan. And so Nicole went back to playing Perfect World, and about an hour later, she noticed there were all sorts of new notifications on her Discord server. And so once again, she stopped her game, she opened up the Discord server, and once again, the entire chat was dominated about Menhaz, because Menhaz had sent a second picture, apparently representing him completing the second step of his big 4-step plan. And once again, everyone's saying there's no way, he's trolling us, this can't be real. And Nicole, she looked at the image itself, and she too thought this has got to be trolling. But now, she wasn't just filled with pure disbelief. She wasn't able to just completely discard what was happening here, because part of her was thinking, like, how is Menhaz getting these hyper-specific images that really are tethered to this exact plan he's laid out? Like, how does he have these images? Where are they coming from? Now, this was back in 2019, and certainly AI technology existed, but not the way it does now, where, the average user can literally in seconds create hyper-specific images using AI. In 2019, that really wasn't available to most people, and so really the only way Menhaz could potentially have these images, at least in Nicole's mind, was he had to have pulled them off some website somewhere and basically pretended they were images that he took. And so Nicole decided she was actually going to take the 2 images he had sent and reverse image search them to try to figure out where they came from, find the website, where he's pulling them from, because clearly these pictures are not authentic. There's no way Menhaz actually took these photos. But when Nicole reverse image searched both images, nothing came up. Now, Nicole thought, okay, that does seem to suggest these are authentic pictures he really did take, which maybe means he's actually doing this plan, even though that seemed totally preposterous. Or she thought maybe, these images have been pulled from such an obscure website somewhere that I don't have access to, finding them in a reverse image search, that maybe that's what it is. And so at this point, Nicole told herself, you know what, there's got to be a reasonable explanation for this, but I'll tell you this, it can't be that Menhaz is actually following through on this plan. It's not possible. And so once again, she minimized the Discord server and got back into the game. But pretty quickly, Nicole just stopped playing the game because her mind was totally fixated on whatever was going on with Menhaz. And so she opened up the Discord server again, and she saw still everybody in the chat was talking about Menhaz and these 2 pictures he had sent. And basically the server was divided. About half the members believed this really was just Menhaz trolling, and the other half was starting to think that, hey guys, this might be real. He might actually be carrying out this 4-step plan. Those pictures might be real. And if that's the case, we have a huge problem. Because this plan, if he actually carries it out, is so completely illegal. He can't do this. This is not okay. And so the faction of members on the Discord server that were starting to sense that this 4-step plan of Menhaz's might actually be real began to talk internally, and they said, look, we can't just sit here and do nothing if Menhaz is actually doing this. We have to stop him. This is not okay. And so in fact, one of these members actually contacted their local police and told them, hey, there's this guy on my Discord server, his username is Menhaz, I don't have his actual name, but he's doing something that could be very bad, and you need to look into it. And so the dispatcher said, okay, well, where does Menhaz live? And the person who had called was like, well, I don't actually know. In fact, I really don't know much about him other than the fact that he goes by Menhaz and he sent these crazy pictures that could be real or not. I don't know. And so eventually the dispatcher just said, look, I get it that you're concerned, but we have nothing to go on here. And remember, this is the internet. People make stuff up all the time. And so pretty quickly after that, the police officer just hung up, and that was that. So at this point, Nicole and the other members of the Discord server who were starting to suspect that what Menhaz was doing could be real, they felt really alone. I mean, the local police was not taking this seriously, which did make sense. I mean, they had nothing to go on. But as a result, it was like nobody was doing anything about what Menhaz was claiming. And Nicole and the other members who, again, were beginning to sense this could be real, they felt terrible about just sitting here doing nothing. And so Nicole and a few other members of the Discord server decided to team up digitally and actually investigate Menhaz themselves, try to figure out who this guy is and really what's he up to. And so Nicole and this new investigative group started by combing through all the chat logs in their Discord server to see if Menhaz at any point had either intentionally or unintentionally dropped hints about his real name and his location. And eventually, they came across a message where Menhaz actually said his real first name was Menhaz. That wasn't just his username, that was his real name. And that was great because Menhaz was a pretty unique name. And so Nicole and the group thought, okay, well, if we find where in the world that name is somewhat common, maybe that will give us a rough idea of where to look for Menhaz in the world. They also knew that Menhaz was a college student, or at least he claimed to be. Now, he never actually said where he went to college, but he would often, in the Discord server, tell people when he was going to be on the server and when he was going to be off the server, like for classes and for studying and that kind of thing. He would say, okay, hey, I'll be on at 6 p.m. tonight, or I'll be off at 9, I'll be back on at 8. He would give these specific times, and he would always use Eastern Standard Time when he did that. And so a natural assumption that Nicole and her group made was, okay, very likely Menhaz lives in the Eastern time zone. And that time zone included the entire East Coast of the United States, Eastern and Central Canada, and also some countries in South and Central America. But while that was helpful, it still created too broad of an area in the world for this group to realistically look for Menhaz. It was nearly impossible to actually figure out where he was. But they now had a sense of where he could be, and they thought, okay, well, why don't we ask somebody else in the Discord server if they can try to track Menhaz's IP address? An IP address can be used to find the approximate geographical location of a computer. And sure enough, someone in the server said they could do that, and within a few minutes, they had tracked Menhaz's computer to Toronto, Canada. However, right at the same time they were figuring this out, Menhaz sent a third picture across the Discord server, a picture that showcased him completing step 3 of this 4-step plan, allegedly. And for Nicole and many other members of this Discord server, this third picture really represented a big shift, because now it was getting terrifying. Because look, it seems pretty likely at this point that Menhaz is actually doing this. This is real. How could he possibly have these hyper-specific photos that are perfectly synced with this 4-step plan he had come up with? This feels real. And so Nicole, she actually asked the person who had traced his IP address to Toronto, she said, hey, should we call the Toronto police and tell them what's going on here? Maybe they can go find him and stop him before he completes this plan. I mean, he's apparently completed 3 steps. There's only 1 step left. We have to stop him here. But the person who had tracked his IP address to Toronto said, look, what are the police going to do? There's 6 million people that live in Toronto. And all we have is that maybe his computer is in Toronto and maybe these pictures are real. And also, by the way, it's pretty easy to mask your IP address. You can use something called a VPN or virtual private network that when you track someone's IP address that has one of those working, it will make it seem like their address is, for example, in Toronto or Chicago or New York or Dallas or anywhere in the world, when in reality, their computer is somewhere totally different. And so the police are not going to launch a manhunt based on an IP address. It's not 100% accurate. And so basically, Nicole realized that even though they saw they are on the precipice, potentially, of Menhaz committing some horrible crime, and they can't do anything about it because they don't really have any information about Menhaz. And so at this point, everybody on the Discord server was basically begging Menhaz to come clean. Tell us these photos are fake. Tell us this plan of yours is really just you trolling. But Menhaz didn't do that. He doubled down and said, oh no, these are all real. And in fact, I'm going to complete step 4 of this plan and complete the whole process in 30 minutes. And after that, all Nicole and the other members of the Discord server could do was just try to convince Menhaz not to do this. Don't follow through with this. Don't complete the plan. You gotta stop. It's not worth it. But Menhaz refused and said, I'm doing this no matter what. And sure enough, 30 minutes later, Menhaz would send one final picture, the 4th picture, showcasing that his 4-step plan was now complete. At this point, someone from the Discord server did call the Toronto police. The following day, at about 3:30 p.m., police officers arrived outside of Menhaz's home, which it would turn out was located in a small town just north of Toronto. The IP address had been correct. By this point, it had now been about 24 hours since Menhaz had sent the very first picture of his 4-step plan. Police knocked on the front door, having no idea what to expect here. They had seen the images Menhaz had sent on the Discord server, but at this point, until they went inside, they had no idea if they were dealing with a terrible crime or a terrible joke. When the door opened, Menhaz himself was standing in the doorway. He had a totally neutral, very calm expression on his face. He was very gracious. He welcomed the police inside. And when they stepped inside, they asked him, what's going on here? And all Menhaz said was, you'll see. So the police walked further into the home and eventually made their way upstairs. And when they got up there, they just froze. Because it would turn out Menhaz was not trolling. Those pictures were not fake. He really had carried out that 4-step plan. It would turn out, for the past 4 years, Menhaz had been living a double life. To his friends and family, he was a college student studying engineering, and he was on a path to great success. When in reality, he dropped out of college in his first year and just pretended to go to school every day, when in reality, he would just go to a local mall and hang out there, and then in the evenings, when school was over and he would come back home, he would just immerse himself in video games, specifically that Perfect World game. That's what he did. He just went to the mall and played video games and lied to his friends and family. But July 27th, 2019, the day Menhaz put his four-step plan into action, was literally the last day he could maintain this ruse. Because the next day, July 28th, 2019, was the day Menhaz was scheduled to graduate from his college. And so his friends and family were all expecting to be there and to see this amazing ceremony. And so to deal with the fact that his real life and his fake life were about to collide, Menhaz came up with his four-step plan. And he literally told the members of the Discord server about his big plan, but nobody believed him because he was always trolling people. It just seemed like, oh, this is made up, another one of Menhaz's lies. But he was not lying. It was all true. Those pictures that he sent across were absolutely authentic. He took those pictures, and they did represent completing each step in the plan. The first picture was of his mother, the second picture was of his grandmother, the third picture was of his sister, and the fourth picture was of his father. And in each picture, those people were dead. Because Menhaz had spent the day methodically killing his entire family to prevent them finding out about his lie. He hit them over the head with a crowbar and then slit their throats and took a picture, posted it to Discord. By the time someone from Discord finally got in touch with the Toronto police, it was too late. Menhaz had obliterated his entire family. Menhaz ultimately pleaded guilty to 4 counts of murder and was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 40 years. A quick note about our stories: they are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, MrBallen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Produced by Jeremy Bone. This episode was written by Kate Murdoch. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Cole Lacasio. Additional audio editing by Jordan Stidham. Mixed and mastered by Brendan Kane. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. There's this one, the MrBallen podcast, as well as MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Run Fool, Redacted, Late Nights with Nexpo, and A Twist of History. All you have to do is search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like this one, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. On a night in 1984, a college freshman listened to the music blaring through a nightclub. A moment later, she grabbed her date's hand and rushed out onto the dance floor. Her first year of college so far had had its ups and downs, but it was nights like these that she'd grown to love. Nights when she could stay out as late as she wanted with whoever she wanted. She and her date danced for hours and then finally headed outside to his car, exhausted and happy. But this young woman had been having so much fun at the club with the guy she was with that she hadn't noticed somebody else who had been standing in the shadows the whole time watching her dance. And now that same person was following her. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the Strange, Dark, and Mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please tell the follow button that you're going to leave your entire fortune to them when you die, but in your will, actually leave it to the share button. Okay, let's get into today's story. On Sunday, May 27, 1984, 18-year-old Laura Salmon left her dorm at Middle Tennessee State University, got into her beige Oldsmobile, and headed down the main road that cut through the college town of Murfreesboro. About 10 minutes later, Laura parked her car at a movie theater, stepped outside, and then waved to a young man who was waiting for her over at the box office. The young man, whose name was Dan Goodwin, was one of the new friends Laura had made since starting her freshman year of college about 8 months earlier. And this was the first time they'd gone out together, just the two of them. Laura wasn't sure if this was a date or not, but Dan's invitation for dinner and a movie definitely made it seem like it could be. She and Dan said hello, and Dan told her he had not gotten the tickets yet, because he didn't know what movie she wanted to see. Laura smiled. A lot of guys she knew would have just picked whatever movie they wanted and not worried about what she wanted at all. The two of them settled on The Natural, a new baseball movie, and they bought some tickets. Dan was a gentleman the whole time, opening doors for Laura, paying for everything, and getting the snacks that she wanted. And when they walked out after the movie ended, Laura was having a good time and was looking forward to dinner. Laura and Dan ate at a restaurant in the same shopping center as the movie theater, and they spent most of the meal getting to know each other better. Laura said college had been a big adjustment from high school, even though she still lived pretty close to her mom. But for the most part, she had enjoyed her newfound freedom. She asked Dan if he had plans for what he wanted to do after college. Laura knew this was still a long way off, but she was already set on her career. She loved performing in plays, and she wanted to be an actress. Dan said he wasn't quite sure, but whenever he thought about it, he always came back to law enforcement. He thought maybe he could be a police detective. Laura laughed. She couldn't think of two more opposite careers than theater actor and cop, but despite their different life ambitions, they got along really well and had a great night. After dinner, Dan walked Laura back to her car, and they said they'd see each other soon. On the drive home, Laura kept laughing to herself. After a whole night out with Dan, she still had no idea if what they'd just done was actually a date or not. But she didn't want to worry about it. Dan was nice and they were friends, and that was not always the case with some of the guys she met in class or at frat parties. And she wasn't necessarily looking for something serious. She'd had a long-term boyfriend for most of high school, but college was different. She didn't want to tie herself down. Early on May 30th, 1984, 3 days after Laura had gone to the movies with Dan, she woke up to the loud beep of her alarm clock. She wanted to yell at herself for staying up so late the night before. She'd had a great time dancing at a local club and hanging out with her date, but now she was going to pay for it. She had an early shift at the supermarket where she worked part-time. Laura barely pulled herself out of bed and then got ready. She put on a pair of blue jeans, a t-shirt, and a black jacket, and then headed out the door for work. The following day, around 5 p.m., a farmer in Murfreesboro drove his truck down a road that ran across the acres of property that he owned. He looked out into a large hayfield near a rock quarry, and he saw something that immediately annoyed him. Somebody had left a pile of clothes out in the middle of the grass. Finding stuff like this had actually become routine because local college and high school kids had turned this part of the farmer's land into a place to party. Now, at least once a week, he had to go pick up trash and collect empty beer cans. The farmer parked on the side of the road and got out of his truck. He slammed the door behind him and walked through some tall grass towards the clothes on the ground. But as he got closer, he stopped and just began shaking his head. He hoped his eyes were playing tricks on him and he wasn't really seeing what he thought he saw. The farmer took a few steps closer and then ran right back to his truck. He sped down the road to his house and he called 911. About a half an hour later, Detective Bob Asbury and two deputies from the Rutherford County Sheriff's Department pulled up to the hayfield and got out of their cars. The farmer had come back and was waiting for them. The farmer ominously pointed to a spot a few yards out in the high grass. The deputies stayed back to ask him some questions, and Detective Asbury put on his gloves and walked out into the field. And there, lying in the grass, he saw the dead body of a young woman. She was nude except for a bra, and her legs were spread open. A woman's black jacket covered most of her face, and lying on top of the jacket were 2 pairs of blue jeans. Asbury couldn't be sure, but the amount of bugs crawling nearby and the condition of her skin made it look like she'd been out there for a while, maybe overnight. Asbury crouched down next to the young woman's body. He could see deep wounds on the side of her head, the kind that usually indicate blunt force trauma. And the detective saw something clutched in her right hand. It was a pair of women's underwear. That detail, along with how her body was laying and the fact that she was almost naked, made Asbury think that this young woman had very likely been sexually assaulted before someone killed her. Asbury eyed the jacket covering her face, and that didn't seem too strange to him. Sometimes killers covered their victims because they couldn't bear to look at what they'd done. But the detective had no idea why somebody had also laid 2 pairs of jeans on her body. He carefully removed the jeans and then lifted the jacket to get a look at the woman's face. He saw deep bruises that looked similar to the other ones on her head, and it didn't take long for Asbury to find a potential murder weapon. He scanned the grass around the body, and he saw a couple of rocks caked with what looked like dried blood. Asbury was confident that one or both of these rocks had been used to beat this young woman to death. The detective stood up and picked up the jeans off the ground, 1 pair at a time. The first pair were men's jeans. Based on the length, they appeared to belong to someone who was at least 6 feet tall. The second pair were women's jeans, and they looked like they could be the victims. Asbury reached inside one of the pockets, and he pulled out a student ID from Middle Tennessee State University. The photo on this ID matched the victim. This young woman was Laura Salmon. Detective Asbury and the deputies worked with a Tennessee State forensics team for hours out in the field. But the only major forensic evidence they found was the blood on the rocks and also the blood spatter on both pairs of jeans. This was 1984, so DNA testing was not used by police yet. But the forensics team would take the jeans and the samples from the rocks to the lab to determine blood type, and to see if they had samples from one or potentially more than one person. That night, when Asbury returned to the station, he found a message waiting for him on his desk. Laura's car had been located at the supermarket where she worked, a few miles away from where her body had been found. It was already getting late, but Asbury had no intention of stopping yet. So, he headed across town to the supermarket and found a couple of deputies waiting for him next to a beige Oldsmobile. The detective shined his flashlight into the driver's side window, and immediately something caught his attention. The driver's seat was pushed all the way back, like someone very tall had been driving. Asbury knew Laura was relatively short, and he knew the men's jeans he'd found near her body most likely belonged to someone much taller than her. So Asbury wondered if maybe the killer had sexually assaulted and murdered Laura, left his pants at the scene, and then driven Laura's car back to the supermarket. If that was the case, it indicated that Laura's killer knew her, or at least knew enough about her to know where she worked. The detective and the deputies did a full search of the car, but nothing else really jumped out. So, after the search, Asbury headed inside the store, and he quickly found a cashier who said she had worked with Laura the previous day. She said that she and Laura had both clocked in at 8 a.m. and worked a 5-hour shift. Afterward, they walked outside together, where Laura got in her car and drove off. Asbury asked this cashier if someone had maybe been waiting by Laura's car for her, but the cashier said she didn't see anybody, and Laura had not mentioned to her that she was meeting up with anyone. Detective Asbury walked back outside and headed to his car. If he was right, a tall man who knew Laura was the last person to drive her car. So he needed to speak to somebody who might know who that man was. The following morning, Detective Asbury met with Laura's mother at her house. Laura's mom had gotten the news about her daughter the night before, and Asbury could tell she hadn't slept since. He didn't want to stay long or push Laura's mother too much, so he offered his condolences and then got right to the point. He said he was looking for a tall man who knew Laura well enough to know where she worked. In his opinion, this guy was probably Laura's close friend or a current or past romantic partner. Laura's mom didn't hesitate. She said she knew someone who fit that description perfectly, a 17-year-old named Kyle Gilley, who had been Laura's high school boyfriend. That afternoon, still less than 24 hours since Laura's body had been found, Detective Asbury led Kyle and his stepfather into a conference room at the sheriff's station. Since Kyle was a minor, Asbury had made sure he had a guardian with him when he came in for questioning. Asbury noticed right away that Kyle looked to be at least 6'2" tall, and he was a big guy too, filled out, not skinny and gangly like a lot of teenagers. He was also very quiet. But without much prodding, Kyle said he'd heard about Laura's death and he was upset about it. The two of them had been together a long time in high school, and they were still close. Asbury asked him what he meant. Were they still a couple? Kyle shook his head. They were friends and they hung out sometimes, but they were not together anymore. The detective quickly followed up and asked if that made Kyle angry. But Kyle said it didn't. He was still in high school and Laura had gone off to college. He understood why, after she had graduated, she had wanted to break up. Asbury sized Kyle up again. Physically, he was the perfect fit for this. So he asked him if Kyle had ever left a pair of jeans out on that piece of farmland where kids in town went to party. Kyle got a confused look on his face. He knew about the spot on the farm, but he had no idea about any jeans of his that had gone missing out there. Detective Asbury finished by asking Kyle where he had been on May 30th, which, as far as the detective knew, was the last time anyone had seen Laura alive. Kyle said he'd come home after school, and he'd stayed there the rest of the day. And his stepfather corroborated that. He said he and Kyle had grilled a bunch of steaks together out on the patio, and then had a barbecue with the family. Following his meeting with Kyle, Asbury continued to fixate on the pair of men's jeans he'd found covering Laura's body. He was convinced those jeans were the killers, so he just had to figure out who they belonged to. So he sent members of his team to meet with some of Laura's family and high school friends, and he drove to Laura's college campus to see if there were any other tall men in her life. Asbury walked up to the dorm room that Laura had shared with two other students. He knocked, and eventually a young woman answered. He showed her his badge, and she let him inside and said that she was one of Laura's roommates. Asbury looked around the room, and it looked like a typical dorm room shared by three young teenage girls. And this just made it hit home how tragic this murder really was. Laura was so young. The detective asked the roommate when she'd last seen Laura, and the roommate said it was the night before Laura had gone to work and never came back. That night, Laura had left the dorm to go dancing at a club with a guy she'd met. And before Asbury could even ask, the roommate said she did not know who that guy was. Detective Asbury spent the day talking to more of Laura's friends and classmates, and none of them seemed to know who she'd gone to the club with on that night. But a few of her friends pointed the detective to another young man, Dan Goodwin, who had taken Laura out to a movie and dinner a few days before she had died. Asbury tracked Dan down on campus, and the young man proved to be completely cooperative. He walked the detective through the entire day he and Laura had gone out. He said they were friends, and the date was totally casual. Nothing romantic or physical at all had happened between them. He also said he had not gone dancing with Laura at the club, and he'd never gone out to that farmland with her. By the time Detective Asbury left the campus, he had two potential suspects he at least knew something about. Dan, the casual date, and Kyle, the high school boyfriend. He also had a third potential suspect who was a total mystery, the guy Laura had gone to the club with. Asbury would follow up on alibis and keep trying to identify the man at the club, but he was already desperate to find some new piece of evidence. The following morning, 3 days after Laura's body was found, Detective Asbury sat at his desk going over Laura's autopsy report. The official cause of death was blunt force trauma, which didn't surprise Asbury at all. But there was something in this report that came as a total shock. There was evidence that Laura had recently had intercourse, but there were no physical signs that usually accompanied cases of sexual assault. This meant there was a strong chance the sex had been consensual and could have happened hours or even the day before the murder. This was not what Asbury had suspected when he'd first seen Laura's body, because she was naked from the waist down, her legs were spread, and she had underwear in her hand. So now, Asbury wondered if her killer had simply staged the scene to make it look like Laura had been sexually assaulted just to throw off investigators. If that was the case, the men's jeans might not belong to the killer at all. They could have been placed there by somebody else. In fact, if the crime scene had been staged like that, Laura's killer might not even be a man. On June 4th, 4 days after Laura's body was found, Laura's mother sat in the chapel crying as mourners filed out of Laura's funeral. Dan, the young man who had gone out with Laura just days before she died, walked up to Laura's mom and said how sorry he was and how wonderful a person Laura had been. Laura's mother instinctively pulled Dan in for a hug, and she told him to please help her find who killed her baby. Dan gave her a big hug back and then looked her in the eye and said he would. He would find Laura's killer. Over the next month, Detective Asbury and members of the Tennessee State Police continued to interview Laura's friends and acquaintances, but they weren't getting any closer to identifying her killer. And then, one afternoon, Asbury got a call from police in Nashville, Tennessee, 40 miles away. The Nashville cop said a woman had just accused a man named John Taylor of raping her, and she claimed that John had told her if she resisted, he would do to her what he did to Laura Salmon. Asbury almost couldn't believe it. It was like the huge tip he had been waiting for had just fallen into his lap. Talking to the Nashville officer, Asbury quickly learned that John had a history of violence, and he went to Middle Tennessee State University just like Laura. Asbury hung up and took off for Laura's campus. When he got there, he looked up John's records and began sifting through those, and then he also spoke to some of Laura's friends he'd already met, and it would turn out that Laura and John went to the same fitness center on campus, and they'd gone to a bunch of the same fraternity parties. At this point, Asbury didn't waste any time. He and a state police officer drove right to Nashville to interview John, who was still in custody on the rape charge. John insisted that the sex between him and the woman accusing him of rape was consensual, and he claimed he never said a word about Laura. That was a total lie. And like Asbury's other suspects, John said he'd never gone dancing at a club with Laura, and he said he barely even knew who she was. Asbury left Nashville later that day feeling frustrated, but despite John's claims that he was innocent, the detective thought he made a very strong suspect. However, unless he could find something concrete connecting John or the other young men who were suspects directly to the crime scene on the farmer's land, then he couldn't go after any of them. Over the next several weeks, Detective Asbury continued to work the case every day, but he never felt like he was getting any closer to solving it. Soon, months passed without any new evidence coming in, and Asbury had other cases he had to start focusing on. During this time, Laura's mother came to the sheriff's station often, but every time she asked for an update on her daughter's case, she got the same reply. There was no new information at this time. And Laura's mom got that same response for years. She watched as Laura's friends graduated college and went on with their lives. She saw the young men who had been suspects in her daughter's murder grow up and start families of their own. And she saw Detective Asbury retire and Laura's case go completely cold. Fast forward to February of 2000, almost 16 years after Laura's murder. Two detectives with the Rutherford County Sheriff's Department stood over a conference table staring down at a stack of file folders. These detectives had been assigned to handle cold cases, and their first big case together was Laura Salmon's murder. The lead detective was Lieutenant Bill Sharp, and the detective assisting him was none other than Dan Goodwin, the same young man who had taken Laura out for a movie and dinner shortly before she died, and the same Dan who had promised Laura's mother he would find Laura's killer. Dan, who was now in his 30s, flipped open one of the folders and saw a photo of Laura. Then he began flipping through pages of notes from the original investigation, and as he did, he felt Lieutenant Sharp standing over him. Sharp leaned down and wrote 3 letters across the top of one of Laura's files, DNA. Dan nodded. Technology had come a long way since Laura's murder, and now DNA testing was commonplace and effective and could potentially solve this case. So the first step the investigators took was to connect with the state crime lab. They arranged for a series of tests to be conducted on the blood samples taken from the rocks found at the murder scene and from the 2 pairs of blue jeans that had been left on Laura's body. All the samples had been well preserved, so the lab felt confident they would find something. However, they informed Dan and Lieutenant Sharp that the lab was pretty backed up, and it might take a while to get results. So while they waited, Dan and Lieutenant Sharp began working their way through the files and re-interviewed everyone they could. They also tracked down Laura's old high school boyfriend, Kyle Gilley, and secured a DNA sample from him. And they did the same with John Taylor, the man who had been accused of rape by that young woman in Nashville. And on a day not long after those samples had been sent to the lab, Lieutenant Sharp approached Dan at the station. Sharp tossed a file folder onto Dan's desk and told him, "Now it's your turn." Dan flipped open the file and saw it was a record of his interview from the original investigation. For a second, it threw Dan off. He'd been so caught up in his work that he hadn't thought about himself as being a potential suspect. But he told Sharp that, of course, he would provide a DNA sample. Despite the fact that Dan was a suspect in this case, he was allowed to stay on the investigation, because after he had provided his DNA sample, he was cleared of any wrongdoing. He was not Laura's killer. In the spring of 2000, a couple of months into this new investigation, Dan and Sharp sat at the conference table, digging through Laura's files like they did almost every day. They had conducted interviews, revisited the crime scene, and they had secured DNA samples, but they were still waiting on DNA test results. And they were starting to feel like the original investigators had felt. There were several solid suspects, but not enough evidence to point to any one of them. But that particular day, something in one of the files jumped out at Sharp for the first time. It was a witness statement from a young woman that seemed to have just gone overlooked during the original investigation, and it was potentially a huge break. Lieutenant Sharp pointed it out to Dan, and Dan just stared in shock. Suddenly, he felt like he was close to solving the murder of his friend and keeping his promise to her mother. Both detectives meticulously went through the other files to see if anyone had ever followed up with this witness, but no one ever had. So Dan and Sharp tracked her down. And even though so much time had passed, this witness said she still remembered that day very clearly, and she stood by her original statement. The detectives knew a single statement from over 15 years earlier would not be enough for the district attorney to take a murder case to trial, but they felt like their investigation finally had a clear direction. Then, on May 31st, 2000, 16 years to the day from when Laura's body was found, DNA test results came back from the lab. Dan and Lieutenant Sharp sat at the table and read the report, and both felt completely energized and like they were almost at the end of this investigation. The test results confirmed that the blood on the rocks and on both pairs of jeans was Laura's, but the blood pattern found on the men's jeans could only have occurred if the person wearing them had been on top of Laura when she was struck in the head. So there was now strong evidence that Detective Asbury had been right from the moment he saw Laura's body back in 1984. The men's jeans belonged to the killer. Dan and Sharp kept reading through the results, and as they did, they kept feeling more and more like the witness they had spoken to must have been telling the truth. And then finally, they saw test results that said DNA samples from bodily fluids had been found in the men's jeans, and they had a match for those samples. Dan stepped back from the table, and he felt like he wanted to collapse, like a huge burden had finally been lifted. After all this time, Laura's murder had just been solved. Based on DNA tests, the witness statement, and evidence collected over 16 years during 2 investigations, the following is what police believe happened to Laura Salmon on May 30th, 1984. That afternoon, Laura walked out of the supermarket with her coworker, said goodbye, and then got into her car. As soon as she began driving, she felt like she might fall asleep. She was exhausted from her night out at the club the night before. She drove a few minutes across town and saw her killer waiting for her right outside of their place. Laura parked, got out of the car, and told the killer how exhausted she was. She also said she could only hang out for a little while. The killer said that was totally fine, and they offered to drive since Laura was tired. Laura tossed her car keys to the killer, and then they both climbed into her beige Oldsmobile. killer immediately had to move the driver's seat way back so they could fit, and then once they were comfortable, they began driving down the main road in town. But a few minutes later, the killer suddenly pulled onto a road that cut through some farmland. Laura asked where they were going, and the killer said it was a surprise. The killer drove a bit longer, and then parked the car on the side of the road by a hayfield that was near a rock quarry. Laura looked out the window. She knew the spot from some parties. It was a beautiful day, and Laura was still feeling pretty sleepy, so sitting outside in this field seemed like a nice way to spend some time. However, before Laura could get out of the car, the killer snapped at her and started yelling at her about the night before. Laura yelled right back and said the killer was way out of line, and then she told them to just turn the car around and drive her back to her dorm. But the killer didn't. Instead, they lunged across the front seat, grabbed Laura, and punched her in the face. Laura's eye and her head immediately began throbbing, but she managed to break free from the killer, and she threw the car door open and began running into the field. The killer rushed out of the car, caught up to Laura, and tackled her to the ground. Laura tried to fight back, but the killer was too strong, and they climbed on top of her and pinned her down. Then, the killer reached over, grabbed a rock off the ground, and slammed it into the side of Laura's head multiple times. Blood sprayed from the wounds, and Laura stopped moving. But the killer wasn't done. They dropped that rock and picked up a bigger one, and they raised it up and then slammed it down right square in the middle of Laura's face over and over again. Finally, the killer stopped. They dropped the rock, stood up, and looked down at what they had done. Laura lay there, dead in the grass. The killer began to panic, but they quickly came up with a plan. They ripped off Laura's jacket, her shirt, her jeans, and her underwear, and then stuffed her underwear into Laura's right hand. And then they deliberately posed her legs so her legs were spread open. When the killer stepped back and took a look at their work, they saw Laura's eyes were staring up at them. So they grabbed the jacket and covered most of Laura's face with it. The killer was about to head back to the car, but they looked down and noticed Laura's blood on their jeans. So without thinking, they just took off their jeans, they also grabbed Laura's jeans off the ground, and they laid both pairs across Laura's body. After that, the killer ran back to Laura's car and drove back to the supermarket where Laura worked. After parking the car, the killer scanned the parking lot. When they saw it was all clear, they hopped out and took off running in their underwear. And when they got there, they found their stepfather waiting for them. Laura's high school boyfriend, Kyle Gilley, was her killer. It turned out Kyle was not okay with their breakup, like he had told police. In fact, the idea of Laura seeing anyone other than him filled Kyle with jealousy and rage. So much so that he had begun stalking Laura. And on the night before her murder, he followed her and her date, a man who was never identified, to the club. Kyle hid in the shadows and watched Laura dance all night, and then he followed Laura and her date back to the guy's apartment, and then waited outside while they had consensual sex, and then followed them when Laura's date drove her back to her dorm. The following day, Laura and Kyle had plans to hang out like they still did sometimes, and when Laura handed Kyle her keys, he knew this was his chance to take her out to the middle of nowhere and make her pay for seeing other men. Like a lot of kids in town, Kyle had been to the farmer's land for parties, and he thought it would be a perfect place to confront Laura because nobody else would be around. But as soon as she yelled at him, he couldn't stand it and he punched her. And this was not the first time he had done that. In fact, during the second investigation, Dan and Lieutenant Sharp had discovered Kyle had regularly beaten Laura throughout their high school relationship. This, of course, raised a huge red flag, but it was the overlooked witness statement that enabled them to fully focus their investigation on Kyle. Because back in 1984, a young woman had told police that on the day of Laura's murder, she passed by Kyle driving on the road, and he was driving Laura's beige Oldsmobile, and Laura was not in the car with him. Dan and Lieutenant Sharp never understood why that lead had not been followed up on, and why Kyle and his stepfather's story about grilling steaks together had just been accepted. But with that witness statement, Dan and Sharp were almost positive Kyle was the killer, and DNA test results soon confirmed that theory. In a moment of desperation, Kyle had staged the murder to look like a sexual assault. He hoped it would lead police to the man Laura had gone to the club with and slept with the night before, but when Kyle saw Laura's blood on his jeans, he panicked and left them behind. Because there was no DNA testing at the time, Kyle would never have imagined that remnants of his own bodily fluids inside those jeans would someday allow police to trace the genes right back to him. Kyle was ultimately sentenced to life in prison, but with a chance for parole in 2042. Kyle's stepfather, who had covered for him in 1984, was deceased by the time Kyle was arrested. Dan had ultimately kept his promise to Laura's mother. He had found her daughter's killer. Dan also said that if he and Kyle are both still alive in 2042, he will be front and center at Kyle's parole hearing, and he'll do everything he can to make sure Kyle never gets out of prison. A quick note about our stories: they are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. There's this one, of course, the MrBallen podcast, and there's MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Runful, Redacted, and Late Nights with Nexpo. All you have to do is search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like this one, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. At 3:45 a.m. on a morning in 2003, police cars raced down a street in a small, sleepy English village. A detective inspector stepped out of his car and approached an old house that was connected to a butcher shop. The man was still in shock from the call he'd gotten. An 83-year-old man had been brutally murdered inside of this house. This type of violence was just not something that ever happened in villages like this. The inspector walked up to the door and knocked, and as soon as the door opened, things only got stranger from there. Because the victim's wife, who came to the door, had seen the men who killed her husband, and the image of one of them was burned into her mind. He was a young man in bright white pants and a hat that looked just like the one the famous fictional English detective Sherlock Holmes wore. Soon, the inspector and his team would find themselves involved in a case where they had no idea what was real and what was simply the imagination of a scared 81-year-old woman. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, just before it rains, sprinkle instant mashed potato powder all over the follow button's front yard. Okay, let's get into today's story. In the early evening of August 28, 2003, 83-year-old Eric Hingston was sitting up in bed trying to catch his breath in the small village of Plympton in the southwest of England. Eric's 81-year-old wife, Audrey, fluffed up a pillow behind him to make sure he was as comfortable as possible. She kissed her husband on the cheek, walked across the small upstairs bedroom, and opened up the window. A cool summer breeze blew in, and Eric instantly seemed to relax. For the past 3 years, Eric had been dealing with a series of health issues. He could only walk short distances with the help of 2 canes, he had heart problems, and he had a catheter. But despite these health issues, his wife, Audrey, had worked hard to give Eric as active a life as possible. And for years, together, they had managed to do just that. But recently, Eric had also begun to suffer from severe asthma, and so he struggled to breathe a lot of the time. He had tried different medicines and treatments, but sitting upright in his bed with the window open seemed to be the only thing that brought him any relief. Audrey turned from the window and looked back at her husband on the bed, and she smiled. She could see his breathing had started to slow down, and he had a calm look on his face now. Eric gave a little smile back to his wife, but it was obviously forced. He hated that he was stuck in bed so much of the time lately. It was just not how he'd imagined his life playing out. And a big reason for that was because Eric had spent the early part of his life in peak physical condition, facing dangers that most people couldn't even imagine. When he was a young man, he joined the Royal Air Force, and he had become a highly decorated World War II pilot who flew covert missions into occupied France. After leaving the military, he no longer risked his life on a regular basis, but he still pushed himself to work hard all the time and to accomplish any goals he set for himself. Eric got married to his first wife, they started a family, and he opened and ran a very successful neighborhood butcher shop that was located below the house where he still lived. And so for decades, Eric had been a highly respected war hero, business owner, and beloved member of the community. But now, he just felt like a burden. Eric's second wife, Audrey, sat down in a chair near the bed and took his hand. The two of them had gotten married later in life, when they were in their 60s, after both of their first spouses had passed away. Audrey knew Eric hated the situation he was in now, but she reminded him that they had shared almost 20 wonderful years together, and she wouldn't trade that for anything. Audrey asked Eric if he needed any more help, but he just said he just wanted to know how the butcher shop was doing. Audrey shook her head and sighed. One of Eric's sons now ran the family business, and he ran it well, but Eric just could never quite let the shop go. Audrey told him she was sure everything was just fine, but she told him she would head down to look into the shop just to check in on things. And so she patted Eric's hand, stood up, walked out of the bedroom, and down a flight of old wooden stairs, and stepped outside of the house. The street where Audrey and Eric lived in the suburban village of Plimpton had barely changed in decades. The butcher shop was connected to the house, but it had its own entrance, and right next door was a popular old neighborhood pub. Stone houses lined the little neighborhood, and Audrey could see the spires of St. Mary's Church, which dated back to the 1300s, rising up in the distance. Audrey walked just a few feet to the entrance of the butcher shop. A bell rang above the door as she stepped inside, and right away she saw Eric's son, James, standing behind the counter and slicing into a piece of meat for a customer. James waved at Audrey, and she walked over, and the two spoke for a few minutes. Eric's children and Audrey's own children had been adults when the couple first got together, so Audrey hadn't played any part in raising Eric's kids. But she'd always gotten along well with all of them, and she was thankful that James had dedicated himself to keeping the family shop up and running. A few more customers walked in, and so Audrey said she didn't want to get in the way of business, so she said goodbye to James and walked back outside. She smiled at a pair of young men who were heading into the pub next door, and she could see the street starting to come to life as people got off from work and headed out for the evening. Audrey took a breath. She missed the days when she and Eric would duck into the pub for a pint and end up talking to their friends for hours, and she knew Eric missed that too. She walked back to the house and put on a smile. She didn't want Eric to see that she was feeling a bit sad about how their lives had changed since he'd gotten sick. Audrey walked upstairs to the bedroom and checked on her husband. He was still sitting up in bed, feeling the breeze on his face. He told her he felt like his breathing was much better, but he was feeling a bit tired, so he might just go to sleep. He asked Audrey to keep the light on, which she almost always did anyways, in case he needed to get up in the middle of the night. Then Eric gave his wife a kiss and closed his eyes. Audrey told him to sleep well. Then she walked to the bedroom door, but she stopped before she walked out. She could hear loud noises coming from the pub next door. She thought about closing the window to block the noise, but she knew Eric could sleep through loud sounds, and having the window open meant he got fresh air. So she left the window open, glanced back at her husband one more time, who was already falling asleep, and then she walked out of the room. At 3:45 a.m. on the following day, August 29th, so several hours after Eric had gone to sleep, Audrey was back in his bedroom, but this time she just stood there in the doorway, trembling. She looked at the open window and then down at the floor, and she felt confused and scared. She slowly walked across the room, picked up the phone on the bedside table, and took a deep breath. With her hands shaking, she dialed 999, the emergency number in the United Kingdom. Minutes after Audrey's call, police and paramedics sped down the small village street towards Audrey and Eric's house, their sirens waking up people all around the quiet neighborhood. Detective Inspector Tony Carney of the Devon and Cornwall Police parked on the street, and followed several paramedics to Audrey and Eric's front door. Carney knocked on the door, and within seconds, Audrey answered. The sight of this small, frail-looking older woman in her bathrobe hit Carney hard. She looked terrified, and when Carney introduced himself to her, he could tell she was confused and struggling to put words together. Carney made sure the paramedics could get inside the house and head upstairs to the bedroom, but Carney stayed at the door with Audrey. Carney's first thought was that this poor woman should not be here while the police searched her house. She should be somewhere else where she felt safe and calm. Carney also knew he was dealing with a crime scene here, and he didn't want Audrey to accidentally touch or move potential evidence. So he asked her if there were any family members she might be able to stay with while the police were inside of her home. Audrey looked up at him and slowly nodded. She said her son was a retired police inspector and he lived not too far away. Carney signaled for another officer to come to the door, and he arranged for him to drive Audrey to her son's house. Once Carney felt sure that Audrey would be looked after, he put on his gloves, stepped inside the home, and walked upstairs to the bedroom. And when he got up there, he felt like he'd stumbled into a TV crime drama or something, because on the floor of the bedroom, he saw all the paramedics gathered around Eric Hingston, who had clearly been dead when they got there. And Eric had been brutally stabbed in his collarbone. On several British TV shows, murders took place in small English villages every week. But in reality, murder cases in places like Plimpton were virtually unheard of. And specifically, the murder of an older man in his 80s like Eric was just really not something that ever happened anywhere near here. Carney glanced around the bedroom. All of the dresser drawers had been pulled open, and clothes covered most of the wooden floor. He looked over at the open window, and on the windowsill, he saw a black plastic bin liner, the British term for trash bag. He walked over to the window, looked in the bag, and saw several pieces of expensive jewelry inside. And something outside the window also caught his eye. Carney leaned out, and in the glow of a single outdoor light, he saw a metal ladder perched against the house just below the bedroom window. Just then, Carney heard someone calling his name. He leaned back inside from the window, turned, and saw a small team of forensics officers entering the bedroom. Carney asked the paramedics to clear out, and he gave the forensics team a few minutes to search the room without getting in their way. And soon, it was pretty clear that all the investigators and first responders believed the same thing. This had to have been a robbery gone bad. Someone must have climbed up the ladder into the bedroom, stolen some jewelry, and then Eric must have woken up, tried to stop them, so they killed him. But if that was the case, Carney wondered why the thief had left the jewelry behind. Did they just panic? Or did Audrey catch them in the act? The thief killed Eric, but maybe they just couldn't bring themselves to kill a woman who probably looked a lot like their grandmother. The forensics team continued their work in the bedroom, and Carney headed back downstairs and outside. Police officers had cordoned off the house with crime scene tape, and the neighbors had come out of their homes and had started to ask questions. Carney had worked cases in a number of other small villages, and he knew that even residents with the best intentions could end up slowing down an investigation. News about crimes in these small towns, especially a violent crime, spread fast and led to wild rumors and speculation and misinformation. And people would start calling the police, claiming they saw dangerous criminals on every street corner and in every pub. Carney walked back to his car and called into the station. He said he wanted a mobile command unit set up near the house, and he wanted officers on site whose sole purpose would be to answer questions from the community and provide as much transparency as possible. After that, Carney walked away from his car and informed the officers outside that they would have help soon. But before Carney could go back into the house, he saw another uniformed officer leading a middle-aged man towards him. The man looked almost as dazed as Audrey had. The man introduced himself as the victim's son, James, and he said he ran the family butcher shop connected to the house. A friend who lived nearby had called him to tell him what was going on, and James said he had spoken to the uniformed officer, so he already knew his dad was dead. Carney eyed James and then looked over at the shop. He wondered if it was too much of a coincidence that James worked at a butcher shop, presumably with knives, and his father was the murder victim who had been stabbed to death. James told Carney he still needed to call the rest of his family to let them know what had happened. Carney said he understood. However, before he left, he wanted to know if anyone who worked at the butcher shop, or anyone who might have worked there in the past, could possibly have had a grudge against his father. James shook his head and said no. He said police could talk to anyone who had ever worked for his dad, or anyone in the neighborhood for that matter, and they would all say they loved Eric, like family. Carney said how sorry he was again, and then told James he would follow up when he needed to, and then Carney walked back inside the house. Up in the bedroom, Carney found the forensics team combing over every inch of the floor and also bagging jewelry and clothing as potential evidence. One of the officers told Carney that they had pulled blood samples from Eric's body, but they hadn't found that much blood on the floors or the walls. They believed the stab wound had been deep enough to puncture Eric's lung and kill him, but it hadn't actually caused a lot of bleeding. The forensics officer said the puncture spot on Eric's body was deeper than it was wide, which most likely meant the blade was very, very sharp. The officer also said that they still had not found the murder weapon or any usable fingerprints in the room or outside of the window, but they would keep on looking. Carney hoped the team would eventually find usable prints, but he thought he might not even need them, because he believed there was a good chance Audrey had interrupted the robbery and gotten a good look at her husband's killer. On August 30th, so a day after the discovery of Eric's body, Carney and his partner, Neil Treby, knocked on the front door of a small house in a town not far from Plimpton. A man in his mid-50s answered. He told the investigators that he was Audrey's son, and that yes, he was a retired police detective sergeant. Carney and Treby felt lucky their potential main witness's son was a former cop. He could help them explain what was happening in the investigation to his mother, and also maybe make her feel safer and more comfortable when she was speaking to them. Audrey's son led them into the front room of the house, where Audrey was sitting on the couch. Somehow, she looked even smaller and more frail than the day before when Carney had met her. But Audrey smiled and politely asked if the officers wanted a cup of tea or coffee. They thanked her, but they said they were fine for now, and then Audrey's son sat down next to his mother, and the investigators sat in chairs across from them. Carney said how sorry he was for her loss. He knew this must all be frightening and confusing. Audrey nodded, but she said she would not let fear or confusion get in the way of helping the police. And then, without any prompting, she said she had seen the men who killed her husband in the bedroom. Carney leaned in and asked if he'd heard her right. There was more than one killer? Audrey nodded and said there were 2 young men. Treby quickly asked if she knew these men, or if she could at least give a clear description of them. Audrey turned and looked at her son, and he told her she should tell them everything she knew. Audrey turned back to the investigators. She told them she had been sleeping in the guest bedroom, and she said she usually did that because Eric liked to keep the window open and the light on at night, which made it difficult for her to fall asleep. And so the other night, or early in the morning, she had woken up when she heard noise coming from the main bedroom where Eric was sleeping. It sounded like someone was groaning and something banging against the wall. Audrey said she figured it was just Eric trying to fumble for his canes to try to stand up and get out of bed, and so she got up and walked down the hall. And at this point, Audrey sort of trailed off. She seemed like she couldn't go on with her story. The investigators didn't want to push her, but her son gently encouraged her to keep going. And at some point, Audrey did begin talking again. She said when she got to the bedroom, her husband was lying on the floor, bleeding, and there were these 2 young men standing over him. One was holding a knife, and the other was holding a plastic bag. She screamed, and when she did, they ran for the window, climbed out, and disappeared. However, the one that had been holding the bag dropped the bag on the way out. But Audrey said before they escaped, she did get a good look at them. She said she didn't know their names, but she definitely recognized them from the village, and they were really distinct looking. She said one was kind of short, maybe 5'8", and the other was at least 6'1", and he wore bright white pants and a deerstalker hat, just like the one Sherlock Holmes wore. Carney glanced over at his partner. He didn't say anything, but a killer wearing bright pants and also wearing a Sherlock Holmes-style hat seemed really bizarre, sort of like he was on some fictional TV crime drama. Carney asked Audrey if she wouldn't mind giving a detailed description of these 2 men to a police sketch artist. He also said that he didn't want to pressure her, but if she was willing to go on TV and speak directly to the public about what these men looked like, it could be helpful. Audrey turned and spoke to her son for a few moments, and then after that, she turned back to the investigators and nodded her head. she agreed to do anything that would help get her justice for her husband and bring some closure for his kids. On September 4th, so 5 days after Eric's murder, Inspectors Carney and Treby stood next to Audrey in a large conference room filled with newspaper and television reporters. Police had already started to circulate the drawings of the suspects around town, but Plimpton was just one of several small villages that surrounded the much larger city of Plymouth, so the investigators believed getting the description out on television was key to reaching more people across the entire area. The investigators also believed if people just saw Audrey telling her tragic story, they might be more willing to help. Carney conveyed the basics of the case to the press, and then he introduced Audrey. She stood there for a second in silence, just staring out at the cameras pointed directly at her. She tried to keep her composure, and she spent a minute looking at some notes she had written down. Finally, in a soft voice, she thanked the community for all the love and support they had shown her and her family in the wake of this tragedy, and then she gave a detailed description of the two men she believed killed her husband. Afterward, Audrey stopped and looked down at the piece of paper shaking in her hands. She swallowed and closed her eyes, trying to fight back tears. After a few seconds, she opened her eyes, looked right into one of the cameras, and said very dramatically that there was no need for these men to have done this to Eric. Even if he had tried to fight them off, he was no threat to these two young men. They could have just pushed him aside and left with whatever they wanted. They didn't have to kill him. This press conference sparked an even bigger outpouring of sympathy for Audrey and the family, but it also led to a level of tension and fear that was totally foreign inside of Plimpton. People were now too scared to go out at night, and shopkeepers considered closing their doors early just in case these two murderous young men were out stalking their next victim. However, within just a few days, Audrey's press conference would prove to have been the right decision. On an afternoon in early September, Carney and Treby were working together in Carney's office when a uniformed police officer opened the door. He told them that two men had come to the station saying they needed to speak to the investigators who were handling the Eric Hingston murder case, because they said they were the men that Audrey had identified as being the killers. Inspectors Carney and Treby rushed through the station, and they found these two young men standing with several officers. And they did look exactly like the two young men Audrey had described. The inspectors felt a huge rush because it was like the solution to their case had just fallen right into their laps. Carney and Treby brought the two young men into an interview room, and Carney asked them flat out if they had come to turn themselves in for Eric's murder. But both young men immediately just shook their heads and said no. The taller of the two men said they'd seen Audrey's press conference, and they immediately knew she was describing them. But they had nothing to do with her husband's murder. Treby said if they knew immediately that they were the men Audrey was talking about, why had they waited several days to come in? The young men looked at each other for a second, and then the tall one kept talking for both of them. He said they were scared. Not only did they match Audrey's description, but they also thought people in the village would decide they were guilty right away no matter what they said, because they happened to live in a bail hostel in town. A bail hostel was a place where people who had been charged for crimes but had been released on bail could live if they didn't have a permanent residence of their own. Essentially, a bail hostel allowed law enforcement to know where they could find these people if they needed to until their case went to trial. Carney and Treby exchanged a look. They knew these young men were right. A lot of people in the village would assume they were dangerous criminals and decide they were guilty of murder regardless of the truth. But this didn't change the fact that Audrey had clearly described both of them, so Carney wanted to know how they could explain that, if they were not the men Audrey had seen in Eric's room. The shorter of the two men finally spoke up. He said he didn't mean any disrespect, but the old woman might just be confused. They had seen her that day, but not in her house. Instead, they had seen her when they were walking into a nearby pub. The taller man then quickly joined in and said after going to that pub, they went back to the bail hostel and stayed in all night. And they said the inspectors could speak to the people in charge of the hostel because the hostel had strict curfews and kept track of when people left and came back. Carney and Treby got the details of this bail hostel, then excused themselves and left the interview room. And immediately, Carney called the hostel, and the person who answered was able to confirm that both of those men were at the hostel at the time of Eric's murder. and so any rush of adrenaline the inspectors had felt when these two men came to the station had now quickly disappeared. Now, there was a chance that these young men could have snuck out of the hostel and made their way to Eric and Audrey's without anybody noticing, but that was not the most likely scenario, especially considering that these two men had literally sought out the police. And if Audrey really had seen them at the pub that day, there was a chance that in her shock and confusion, she had just remembered these two guys when she was trying to picture the men who were inside of her house. Carney and Treby returned to the interview room. They let the two young men go, but made it clear they would follow up with the bail hostel, so the men should make sure not to leave the village anytime soon. But once the young men were gone, Carney and Treby admitted that if Audrey had confused these two guys with the actual killers, the investigation basically had nothing to go on. With two potential suspects off their list for the time being, Carney and Treby decided to head back to Eric and Audrey's neighborhood. At the mobile command center the police had set up near the house, the inspector spoke with shop owners, old family friends, and delivery drivers and paperboys who might have seen something while they were on their routes early in the morning when Eric was killed. But nobody seemed to have seen or heard anything unusual. And so with very little to go on, Carney and Treby couldn't help but keep coming back to the idea that their victim ran a butcher shop and he had been stabbed with what forensics officers believed was a very sharp blade, something that would be in a butcher shop. So maybe two men from the shop had broken into the house and killed Eric with a butcher knife. They most likely would have had easy access to the home, working so close. But when they spoke to Eric's son James and the few other people who worked at the shop, all of them appeared to have very strong alibis, so the inspectors could not directly tie any of them to the break-in or to Eric's murder. On September 11th, 2 weeks after the murder, Carney and Treby started to feel like the case was already slipping away from them. Their interactions in the community had not yielded any new evidence, forensics officers had returned to the house but still had not found any usable prints, and test results from the blood samples taken from Eric's body and the bedroom floor only matched Eric. And to make things even more bleak for the investigation, several people connected to the bail hostel had now officially corroborated the young men's alibi. So it seemed like the killer in the bright white pants with the Sherlock Holmes hat was really just a product of Audrey's fear and confusion. That day, while Carney and Treby continued to look for anything they might have missed in their case files, they suddenly got a call from a police officer in a nearby town. They put the call on speakerphone, and they could both tell right away that this officer sounded upset. He said he had been dispatched to Audrey's son's house because Audrey had attempted suicide by overdosing on pills. The officer said that paramedics had gotten Audrey to the hospital fast enough to save her life, but he also said he had found a suicide note on site, and the note read, "Please catch the terrible people who ruined my life. I cannot live without Eric." As soon as Carney and Treby hung up, a sense of guilt hit both of them. They knew their investigation had not really been going on that long, but the fact that they still had not found the killers had clearly taken a toll on Audrey. Carney and Treby left the station and headed right to the hospital to check on Audrey in person. When they arrived, they learned that Audrey was okay, however, for now, she just needed to rest and recover on her own. So the inspectors, instead of speaking to Audrey, spoke briefly with a social worker who had met with Audrey when she was first brought into the hospital. And after this conversation, the inspectors decided they needed to start from scratch. There had to be something inside of Audrey and Eric's house that they and their team had simply missed, and they had to make sure they found it before anything like the suicide attempt happened again. Not long after this hospital visit, Carney and Treby led their investigative team back to Audrey and Eric's house. And this time, they wanted to recreate the robbery and murder as best as they could, hoping this might lead to hidden fingerprints or some new idea about what could have happened. They started by having two police officers place the ladder outside against the house, scale it, and then try to climb into the bedroom window. And what they discovered is because of the way the window was designed and where it was situated in the house, it meant that somebody would have to awkwardly stretch up from the ladder, grab onto a small piece of cement, and pull themselves up and over the windowsill and into the bedroom. This proved to be so difficult that even the youngest, most fit cop on the team couldn't do it. And so the only other option for the killers, assuming they were using this ladder, would have been to use the ladder to climb onto the roof of the house and then scale down from the roof and sort of swing themselves into the bedroom. And this scenario, much like the first one, required a lot of strength and to some degree a level of fearlessness because the risk of falling was quite high. And even with all that, it still would have been really hard to pull off. So police wondered if maybe the killers had somehow practiced this maneuver beforehand. After the investigative team tried several more times to run through various ladder scenarios, they headed back inside the house to do another complete search. Now, Carney and Treby had no idea if during this search they would find anything new. The house had already been searched on 3 separate occasions. But they still encouraged their team to literally look everywhere in this house, even in places where it didn't even seem possible that a clue could turn up. And after another lengthy search, when Carney and Treby had both become convinced that they were going to come up short again, they heard an officer shouting their names from the kitchen. Carney and Treby ran through the house. In the kitchen, they saw an officer standing by an open drawer with his back to them. Carney asked what was going on, and the officer said he'd found something that was stuck in the small space between the drawer and the counter the drawer was in. Carney and Treby just stood there with bated breath as this officer jimmied the drawer to try to free what was stuck there. And then finally, the officer got it free, and he turned around, and in a gloved hand, he showed them what was stuck. It was a knife with a red handle and a sharp 7-inch blade. It was the type of knife that would most likely be used by a chef or a butcher. That knife was immediately sent to the crime lab for testing, and when the results from those tests came back, it only confirmed what Carney and Treby already knew. This knife had cracked Eric's murder case. Based on test results from the crime lab, forensic evidence, and interviews conducted during the investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Eric Hingston. In the early morning hours of August 29, 2003, the killer dragged a tall metal ladder from Eric and Audrey's back garden to the side of the house. It was dark, except for a couple of house lights on the street, and the neighborhood was completely quiet. The killer placed the ladder against the house beneath the bedroom window, and as they placed it there, the metal of the ladder clanged against the concrete of the house, and the killer froze. They looked around nervously, but there were no signs that the noise they had just made had attracted any attention. So after that, the killer, instead of walking up the ladder, walked around to the front door of the house and went inside. And they headed up the stairs, holding a sharp 7-inch blade in one hand and a plastic bin liner in the other. Each step they took on the staircase made the house creak, so the killer moved slowly, trying to make as little noise as possible. The killer reached the top of the stairs, walked down a short hallway, and entered the bedroom where Eric was sleeping. The light was on, and the killer saw Eric sitting up in his bed. However, he was fast asleep. The killer placed the plastic bag down on the floor, then took a breath, gripped the knife tight, and walked across the room. They stood over the side of the bed, staring down at Eric. Then they raised the knife up and slammed it down into Eric's collarbone. Eric woke up, wheezing and trying to scream. Blood began running down his shirt, and he used all of his strength to pull himself up out of bed, but as soon as he was up, he just collapsed and fell to the floor. The killer just stood there, watching Eric as his breathing got slower and more strained, until Eric went still. He had died. The killer then walked to the dresser, opened up the drawers, and began tossing articles of clothing all over the floor. When they had almost emptied the dresser, they stopped, went over and grabbed their bin liner, and then walked over to a jewelry box that was sitting on the bedroom vanity, and they dumped most of the jewelry that was inside of it into the liner. The killer carried the now full bag across the room and placed it on the windowsill. Then they looked outside through the open window to make sure the ladder was still in place, and it was. Satisfied, the killer left the bedroom, went downstairs, but instead of going outside, they went into the kitchen, and they calmly hid the murder weapon in the space between a kitchen drawer and the counter. After that, the killer walked to the front room, sat down on the couch, and waited almost 2 hours before they called the police to report a robbery and a murder that had taken place inside of their own home. 81-year-old Audrey Hingston had murdered her husband. It turned out that Audrey had grown tired of having to take care of Eric full-time. She missed her old life of going out, visiting the pub, and spending time with her friends. Over the years, Eric's health issues had started to make her feel completely trapped, so she came up with a plan to kill him and make it look like a robbery. Audrey went as far as to pick the two young men she would pin the murder on. She often saw these two young men walking around the neighborhood and visiting the pub, and she knew they lived in the bail hostel, so she thought they would look guilty. But even after these suspects that Audrey identified came to police and provided strong alibis, Carney and Treby didn't turn their attention to Audrey and think she was guilty. Instead, they truly believed that Audrey had just been confused, and that she really had seen two young men robbing her house and killing her husband, just not these two young men. However, following Audrey's suicide attempt, the inspectors met with a social worker who'd been speaking to Audrey. And the social worker said it was so strange, but despite what Audrey's notes said about the reason she had attempted suicide was because of her grief over her husband's death, that this social worker's experience with Audrey had been that Audrey had almost no grief or sadness about her husband being dead. And so after hearing this, the inspectors did not immediately believe this 81-year-old woman was a murderer, but they thought she might not be telling them the whole truth about what had happened. And so it was at that point that they tried to recreate the break-in using the ladder outside to get a better idea of what Audrey might have witnessed. But the inspectors quickly discovered that it would have been incredibly difficult, if not downright impossible, to pull off the break-in using the ladder. So when police found the knife hidden in the kitchen, they felt confident that there had not even been a robbery at all, that nobody had used the ladder to break in, and that instead, very likely, someone close to Eric had simply entered his house through the front door and killed him. Now, at this point, the inspectors suspected that either Eric's son, James, or maybe one of the other workers at the butcher shop were the killer. However, the only DNA found on that knife discovered in the kitchen was Audrey's. The inspectors had followed up with James, and when he heard about this knife that was found in the kitchen, he was in complete shock, because he said just a week before the murder, Audrey had come into the butcher shop and asked him to sharpen that specific knife. After Carney and Treby confronted Audrey with all of this evidence, her son, who was the former policeman, was sure his mother had killed Eric, and he convinced her to confess. At the time, Audrey became one of the oldest women in British history to be jailed for murder. But because of the circumstances and her age, she actually only served 7 months in prison. After her release, she was banned from returning to Plimpton or contacting Eric's family for several years. Audrey died in 2016. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. This podcast, the MrBallen podcast, and also MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Run Fool, and Redacted. Just search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts to find all of these shows. To watch hundreds more stories just like the ones you heard today, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.